parts of it and talk about them.
Okay, I'll take that.
Because there's a lot of good stuff in this one, and I don't want to rush it. Plus, it sets up the really more in-depth chapters to come.
I love the reading, by the way, and I'm learning a lot. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I interrupted you. My bad. I'm glad you're enjoying it.
Because I'm just a total novice, as you see.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, at some level we all are. I mean, I might on these calls often be playing the role of trying to explain what I think Kenneth means by things, but I'm not nearly as well read as he is. I've never taught philosophy. I just don't have the.
Well, I admire your breadth and depth of knowledge, as I told you already. My exposure to philosophy is through ethics, which is practical philosophy.
Well,
so I learned a little bit about Kant and Jeremy Bentham, deontology, and utilitarianism. The greatest good. I'm a doctor, so that's where I come at this.
Sure.
Right. Very interesting. So, but I've always been interested in philosophy. But when you're a straight, concrete thinker, this circular thinking is hard to grasp.
Yeah. Yeah. I talked to Kenneth yesterday. He can't join us yet, but if we keep doing these long enough, he will. He and his wife have been moving out of their old house in Duncanville, near Dallas. Sorry, near Houston, to their new place in Austin for 10 years. He's got so many books, and CDs and tapes and works of art, and the Duncanville house was just crammed. It was like walking into a hoarder's house if the hoarder was only hoarding amazing things,
I can understand that, because his writing takes 4 or 5 sentences to get to the point where I can understand it.
Sure. So they've got that house now almost completely emptied out. There's just 1/3 of a room left to go with some books in it. And so he's going to focus on that for the next month or two. And when that's done, then he'll join us on these calls. And that'll be a riot, because that guy likes to laugh.
Oh, that's great. And I like this because I come from a family of daughters. So this is like real. And then I raised a son.
Right.
So it's just amazing to me,
Yeah, yeah.
Where could I read more about Kenneth Smith? Does he have a Wikipedia page? There's quite a few Kenneth Smiths out there.
I think David Roll is the best guy to point you at the material that's available, because he himself put most of that material online. So there's a blog that captures some of his old emails and discussions. There's this website that introduces some of his material.
Okay, I found that page. So this is the Kenneth Smith then.
Yeah.
If you found this page, then this is the answer to your question.
Okay, great.
Yeah, it'll get you started.
Isn't he the one? He has like a book on roadkill or something like that. Is that Kenneth Smith?
No.
No, it's not him.
Yeah, I don't know of a book on roadkill.
Oh, that's weird. I thought that's what it was. I looked it up on Google. He was a philosophy professor.
There's quite a few Kenneth Smiths out there, so you gotta.
Yeah.
I see.
He's Kenneth Ray Smith, but he never uses his middle name because he says it makes him sound like a boxer. And
I see.
Wrong impression. Yeah, he's got a few books out, a few short books out, but he's got piles and piles of papers and essays and the email thread that David's been putting online for years. And that's the bulk of his material. And like on my laptop, I have drafts of about 12 more Kenneth Smith books that are in various processes of getting ready to publish.
Wow.
So there's a huge amount of material. It's just a tremendous amount of it is like stuck. We're part of what David's doing by running these is, helping us to get closer to the point where we can get more of this material out there.
What is it about him that you like, or that interests you, or that amplifies philosophy? And I'm asking this because I just don't know.
Well, so I'll tell you how I ran into Kenneth Smith and got hooked. And that's slightly different because it's more story based. But maybe it's maybe it's the right way to do it. I was into comic books growing up, and I had friends who had better taste than I did in high school who introduced me to the new wave of comics as art, where people were doing serious literature in comics form. And now that stuff is well known. You see it all over the place. But back in the 80s, it wasn't, comics still had the reputation of, pow, sock, bam. And so this by getting into this community of people who were taking comics seriously as art, I ended up running into a magazine called the Comics Journal, which was published out of Seattle by Gary Groth. And it was the preeminent journal that attempted to deal with comics as serious art. It would cover people who did comics journalism of what was happening in Palestine, in comic form, or cartoon history of the universe, or attempts to explain physics in comics form. All that stuff would all be included in it. And
repeat that again.
It was called the Comics Journal.
Yeah.
The Comics Journal.
Thank
you. In the back of the Comics Journal, eventually there started up this weird little column. It was only ever 1 or 2 or 3 pages. And it was weird because it mostly wasn't about comics. And most people didn't like the column and would write into the, you could read in the letters to the editor page in each issue of Comics Journal, people railing about, what's this stupid column doing in the back? We hate it. And why does he use all these words we don't understand? We don't like him at all. Please stop. But Gary was friends with Kenneth Smith, and he admired his philosophy work, and he was frustrated that it wasn't getting published. And so he was offering him this little venue where he could put out, this column, one installment at a time. And what I discovered was that although I'm a pretty smart guy, Kenneth Smith's use of language was better than mine. He knew, he had a bigger vocabulary than I did. And more importantly, he wasn't deploying it gratuitously, which rules out, most people with a better vocabulary are doing it to show off. But I did an exercise with one of his columns that was really frustrating me because there were so many things I wasn't understanding in it, where I did all the follow-up research to figure out, what is he actually saying here? I tracked down his references, I got out the encyclopedia, looked at Wikipedia and all those things. And then I tried to say the same things using short words. And what I discovered is that it took a lot more space. Because he had such a density of meaning, like a great poem, that it really, despite how difficult it was, the only way to make it easier was to make it longer. He had compressed a lot of meaning into a little space. And that was when I decided anybody who could do that with that command of so many subjects and such an excellent vocabulary, so well used, I absolutely had to meet it. So I wrote to him, and then I called him, and then eventually I visited him. And that was how we got to know each other. And I discovered about his books and all the other things. And I got hooked because I like people who challenge me. It's one of the things that the Greeks used to talk about, is that the worst thing that can happen is to be the smartest person you know, because then who's going to challenge you? Who's going, or the fastest person, or the strongest person, or the kindest person? If you're sort of in your local group of friends and family, if you're sort of at the peak, you atrophy because you're not being properly challenged. There are other people at your level. They're just out there somewhere, and you have to find them so that they can push back at you, and you can see your weaknesses and limitations more clearly and know where you have to grow. So I definitely wanted to surround myself with people who were smarter than I am and had a better vocabulary. I wanted to grow. And that was what got me hooked. But what kept me hooked is that his approach is not ideological. Almost all philosophers have a system, and they want you to believe their system. They want to teach you that system, indoctrinate you, and have you repeat it to others. And that's their goal. That's what they're after. And, after living through the 20th century, I think most of us are suspicious of ideologies and their ability to enlighten, or rather trap, our minds. And what I discovered about Kenneth Smith that I liked so much, and that keeps me going back to him, is that he has the opposite approach. What he wants to do is be able to represent different perspectives, not just any one that he claims is right. He wants to be able to let Kant speak in Kant's own words, or Hegel speak in Hegel's own words, or have Hegel and Plato have an argument about free will. I'm envious of the students that he had in college, because they could pitch him these topics And then he would, in front of class, role play different philosophers arguing with each other about what they had to say about that subject and how they felt about each other's philosophies and answers on the subject. That's that thing that we need to learn how to do, is to dislodge our head out of being stuck in a single perspective and being able to shift modes and see with, binocular, trinocular, quadranocular vision, as it were, the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. So that's really why I keep going back to it. Is well, even in this short, Daughters and Granddaughters, right? What is this? It's less than 10 pages. It's short, but since last week when David and I sort of decided we would do this week, I spent the whole week chasing down references, building a bibliography and notes of, who are all of the authors that he refers to and brings into the discussion. Like Hermann Hesse, right, is in here. Steppenwolf, he makes it off reference to, Wolves of the Steppes. He's talking about the novel Steppenwolf, which I haven't read, although I've, known about it for decades. But suddenly here's Hermann Hesse in our conversation, right? And then there's Hegel, and then there's Heraclitus, and they're sort of all commenting on this theme of daughters and granddaughters. And I like it because it means even a short essay on a seemingly single subject ends up being connected into the larger context, the longer historical conversation. So that was my long-winded answer to your short, simple question.
No, I like it. I like it because you gave me 2 points: the writing and the approach is not ideological. And we're reading the book now, The History of Philosophy by Durant.
Oh yeah.
In another group, and I like that a lot.
Yes.
Because it's a very, very good introduction, but the chapters are very ideological. What you get is each philosopher, the ideology from each philosophy with input from the author himself. And to a total novice, it's a challenge to separate the two.
Yeah.
Sharon, I just finished Lessons from History from Will Durant. It's much shorter, only 100.
Much shorter?
Only like 110 pages or so. It was on the recommendation of Ray Dalio. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He makes a lot of waves. He's a financial guru and gives a lot of advice to the millennial generation. And anyway, that was one of his book recommendations. So I just finished that. Good. Yep. Someone just threw it into chat there.
Me.
Well, did you read the other one so you could do a comparison?
I read it, some of it, a very, very long time ago.
Sharon, tell me the name of yours again.
A History of Philosophy by Will Durant.
That's his seminal work, I think, that a lot of college courses cover. And
well, let me tell you, I'm just eating it up, and I'm determined to read every page.
Yeah.
It's extremely informative. It's just like I can't get enough of it.
Yeah, it's delightful. There's I've only read bits of it. I haven't gone all the way through it, and I really should.
I'll talk a little bit. I think I've only been exposed to Ken Smith in this group 1 or 2 other times, and I've just been joining these as something fun to do to relate to people during our lockdowns here.
Yeah,
and found I really enjoyed not only his use of language, as you pointed out, Rick, but also his scathing political and social commentary, which I happen to agree with. I mean, he's really been able to articulate, I think, some of what has transpired over the last 15 years as technology has advanced, and we've seen the rise of some of these totalitarian or oligarchic type of figures. He points out the Bushes in this essay here.
right.
He's really able to do it in a way that it's so scathing and pointed, and yet perhaps it's because I agree with it, but it seems almost less incendiary than a lot of, like, I wouldn't call it clickbait. It's it's a critique that's done in a very effectual way, I guess is what I would say.
It's a formal dissection,
I find.
Yes. He's performing a formal dissection rather than an ad hominem. When he goes at these people for their personal characteristics, he doesn't do it like you're a poo-poo head. He does it like, behold the Banausic mindset and how it privileges this over that, and therefore the world looks like this to it, and it makes decisions in this way and causes all this pain to everybody else. He's sort of showing these tendons and muscles of the human psyche, drawing on Hegel and Kierkegaard and Heraclitus to bring them to bear on contemporary events.
I also really appreciate, I guess what I was trying to say earlier is he has a moral dimension
Yes.
to his critique that you don't find in, let's say, the New York Times article about
Yes.
so-and-so, the Bushes, who are really trying to do the exact same thing, exposing, I'll just take the Bushes since they're in the essay here, exposing criminality, talking about the degradation of culture and society. They're really trying to do the same thing, but they do it in such a different way. And
Right.
I find that in the popular press, you don't get into these questions of morality and values, whereas with him and in philosophy you do. And that's really the piece that's missing that cements the critique. Otherwise, what are we critiquing? I mean, there
Yes.
must be something to critique against and measure against. And so when you have this hierarchy of values and you can say culture is degrading over time, here is the evidence, just some of the things that I think he does so well. So that's wonderful that you guys are putting him out there.
Well, I think the intellectual outreach of the press is much, much less than any of these essays.
Yeah.
And I think that's why the information, like I read the New York Times on a Sunday, and I go through it very quickly because there's not that much girth to it. It's more informational, situational, what's happening, rather than looking for it for any explanation, any commentary on morality of the situation. It's just like a newspaper. That's what it is, because they have to write for 8th graders, I think.
Yeah, right. The part of it is the talking down. Part of it is the not wanting to drive away advertisers or offend their board of directors or owners. And part of it is just the complete acceptance of the Banausic mindset, which Kenneth Smith skewers so much, which is the belief that value-free information is good, that it is important and good, that we should not make moral judgments. So, if Hitler's rounding up Jews and putting them in death camps, well, we shouldn't have an opinion about that. We should just report it objectively. This is the Banausic perspective, right? That it's okay for information to exist in a value evacuated context. And Kenneth savages that perspective. He says, the value-free information is worthless and dangerous. If knowledge is power, value-free information is putting power in the hands of the most amoral people among us, and that all information needs to come along with its ethical context so that we understand what the significance of this information is, and it can help to drive us to the kinds of actions required to make a better world.
It's interesting. It's sort of is a parallel to ancient wisdom traditions who would hand down their teachings, and there was a lineage there. Instead of just writing the bullet points and having this value-free information, hey, here are the 10 things you need to do, that was couched in that tradition, and that was so important. And now you could really see why. Again, just the wisdom of the ancients, I mean, is really just so impressive. I feel like we've lost touch with that.
Yeah, when we were talking about lessons from history and a history of philosophy, I wanted to mention Nietzsche's Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks to anyone who hasn't read it. Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks is short. It's he does some coverage of different Greek philosophers in it. But he doesn't do it in a neutral. He doesn't do it in a neutral way. He does it in a value judging way. What is this person contributing to the development of philosophy, and is it healthy, or is it making us sicker? And that tradition of saying, let's not pretend we're the first people to face these questions. Let's acknowledge that there's a deep tradition of thinkers wrestling with the meaning of these kinds of situations, and make sure that when we ourselves approach these issues, we do so bringing all that to bear as best we can. So it's like you can't read a Kenneth Smith essay without sort of adding to your list of things to read, because he's constantly bringing in these other people and says,
correct.
What would Hegel have to say about what Bush said in the news today? Which I think is a better way to study Hegel than to just say, here is Hegel's system, now put it on a shelf and admire it. And if I ask you in a test, then regurgitate it, and the end. That's all you need to know. It's like that academicizing approach to teaching philosophy kills the spirit of the philosophers and doesn't let them speak to us about the things that concerned them and that concern us today.
Right, it's philosophy applied. It's the difference between reading about statistics in a textbook and then as opposed to going out and doing a statistical sample on your own and seeing the principles working in action, you know?
Right.
You really have to apply the knowledge.
Right.
Practical philosophy.
And it's interesting too, because if you dig up some of these, hefty philosophical works like Kierkegaard's Either or Hegel's The Phenomenology of Geist, yeah, Dowdy, you're right. School makes one hate philosophy. In fact, Kenneth Smith has a critique of that. He says that in the modernist order, where the last thing the modern world wants is disruption of its systems of power and its conflicts of interest, it has systems in place to capture and funnel and disarm any dissident elements. So if you have eristic philosophical tendencies, then you're a threat to the system. And so philosophy departments, he says, although there's always exceptions, it's not a perfect system. There are people, sometimes people get through. But generally speaking, at most major universities, the purpose of a philosophy department is to attract people who might be inclined to question the system and then mentally disarm them, so that by the time they get their degree, they're just academically filing away who different philosophers are and what they thought, and they're no longer challenging the world. He's this was the result of the time that he spent teaching in Texas and in New Orleans.
Well, one of the things I find fascinating as I go through Durant's book is I find that the time in which we're living now, the political time in which we're living here, I find so much commentary on it, so much commonality, so many identifiable things. Because one of the things I know is that nothing changes. Things just repeat themselves. History repeats itself over and over. And you got to know your history in order to appreciate the present.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I believe. And so I think in, say, another 100 years, I'd like to read what the philosophers think about the time we're living in now.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess my third answer, Sharon, to your question about why do I like Kenneth Smith is if I pick up Either or by Kierkegaard, or I pick up The Phenomenology of Geist by Hegel, or any other really hefty work, and I read it and I study it and I think about the quality of the thinking and the writing that's gone into it, and then I pick up a hefty Kenneth Smith essay, I find him at the same caliber as these guys. I find him at the same caliber as Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Hegel and Kafka and Arendt and the others. I've read a lot of Arendt, for example, The Human Condition Between Past and Future, Origins of Totalitarianism. And I think he writes at that level. I think he writes at the level of a serious historic,
yes,
a philosopher of historic importance. But the difference is he's writing right now. And I can't ask Nietzsche what he thinks about Bush. I can't ask Hegel what he thinks about the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I can't engage them directly. I can only do it indirectly by trying to extend what I think the implications are of their philosophies. But I can engage Kenneth directly. I mean, I can ask him, so when you equate the yin and the yang in this essay with masculine and feminine, are you falling into the trap of gender essentialism, from the 20th century? Are you that was the norm before the trans movement in the last couple of decades? Are you missing something here? Are you slipping into something? And that's exciting because, as you can see in Nietzsche's writing, particularly more than some of the other philosophers are just like anybody else. They grow, they change, they learn, their opinions, get more sophisticated over time. And the danger of reading a dead philosopher is that they seem to be speaking eternally from an ossified place, as though that's the only thing they ever thought. This is my philosophy, the end. Whereas the truth is, a real philosopher is wrestling with issues over time and is supposed to be advancing and getting a deeper understanding. You can see that in Nietzsche.
Yeah, so what I hear you saying is the third reason you like him is because of his current contemporary philosophical critique, which is very broad.
Yeah, and the ability to engage him directly on the things that concern us.
Okay.
If there's some philosophical issue that's concerning you, we can actually take it to Kenneth and challenge him about it. Like my wife and I were up late last night talking about Daughters and Granddaughters from a feminist, from a perspective of marginalized peoples, BIPOC people of color, from the LGBTQ perspective, especially from the trans and gender essentialist perspective. And I've got all these annotations now on this essay, some of which I'm prepared to talk about today and next week, and some of which I'm going to bring up with Kenneth and I'm going to poke him. I'm going to challenge him and say, so let's talk about gender. One of the things he definitely wanted to pass on to the group, even though he couldn't be here, is that he actually thinks in some ways it's better that we're tackling these essays that came out of his emails because they're not as finished as his books. And so they've got, they represent a point in time when he was wrestling with an issue. And if we were actually trying to publish these right now, he'd be really uncomfortable because he'd want to go back through them and find all the places he now disagreed with what he said then, so that he could, bring it up to current and make sure that when it was published, it was his current thought. But if it's just the email as it was at the time, then he's fine with us attacking it because that's what he would do if he were trying to publish it. He'd go into it and go, no, this isn't right. Okay, fine, that part's okay, and change it. And so the process that we're going through of wrestling with it is the same process that he would like to do, and that he finds as part of the core of philosophy. It's not memorizing people's systems. It's wrestling with the issues and trying to see more deeply. So, when we go at him like this, we're actually engaging in philosophy.
Yes.
What would you guys say is the central theme of this essay? And if I had to summarize it in one sentence, to me, it seems as though he's struggling with what kind of world are we creating? And are we even aware of the world we're creating?
Yes.
When you look at a baby, you see the innocence and all the wonder and the possibilities. And then as it grows older, you see the dichotomy between feminine and male roles. And we lose a sense of where the middle path is, and society starts to stratify. And then that engenders this, towards the end of the essay, this sort of domineering approach to decision making, where you have these people sort of stealing essentially culture and material wealth, spiritual wealth, attention, just stealing everything they can just for the sake of stealing, really. And let's stop and think about what are we creating here? What are we doing? Because all of us are participating, whether we realize it or not. That to me seems to be what he's calling us to do here.
Yeah, the juxtaposition of the vulnerability and immediate immersion in life of an infant contrasted with this exploitative labyrinth that we've created out of the adult world, and looking at how much of that arises from the natural process of maturation, of growing up, and how much of it is a distortion of that process that creates an unhealthy world that we don't want to bring our kids into. So that we want to change the world to make the kind of world that we feel as parents or grandparents, that we would feel okay about giving them, as our legacy to them to live in. And that tension, that I think this essay is about, that creative tension of, this isn't it. This is not the way we want. This is not the world we want to give our kids and grandkids. And then he just riffs off of that, right? He's using that as a basis for then getting into, how does an infant see the world? How does that relate to gnosis and noesis, the different modes of thought that underlie the different character types? He uses that to get into, at a cosmic level, physics and yin and yang, and the way systems work through interpenetration versus dominance. How does, and then I think he overreaches. Part of my critique is going to be, I think he tries to equate some things that only sort of parallel each other and don't actually equate. And I think if he were doing the book, he'd go back to that and change that, because he over abstracts in a few places. But the material that he's working with, I think, is really rich material. what is the nature of gender? What is the nature of yin and yang? How does the mind work? What kind of world would be healthy for people whose minds work this way? And what can we do to make a better world for our kids? But that's a rich stew.
Does he have? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
If I had to do like a criticism of Kenneth, I think he doesn't delve deep enough into the psychology of it, that he jumps to culture. And in my thinking, there's a psychological situation that underpins the whole thing, which is that, like in a like Jacques Laplanche or Artie Lang kind of way, that the parents are kind of lost, in their own thing. And what's presented to the children is a very confused picture. And that's sort of like the underpinning of the whole thing. And to lay it into culture and stuff, sure, it's there, but there's something underneath it that's going on and is missed by not kind of going deeper into what's happening in, the acculturation that the family does, that's not based off of, the cultural matrix, but the, multi-generational just confusion and kind of like the, like an opiate kind of thing, a delusional thing is the best they can kind of do. And that's why they can't get anywhere, is they don't realize they're stuck with like a thing that doesn't make any sense,
Mm-hmm.
And Patrick, for the psychological reasoning, I might offer, I'll just read from page 5, and I referenced it before. I was really impressed with how he brings up the middle voice between active and passive, the echo of our own activity within ourselves, talking about this overlooked, how we're so stratified. Let me just keep reading from where I am here.
Yeah, please.
We'll go through here. There are in ways exaggerated and in ways suppressed by growing up as girls and indulged in their self-feeling sensitivities, and boys are hardened to overlook such meanings as suspicious self-preciousness, the middle voice between active and passive, the echo of our own activity within ourselves, including the many ways in which we self-victimize ourselves if we do not become witting about this, exactly as you said, how we're not aware, so we're self-victimizing. This is a tenuous and elusive miracle that makes civilization and culture possible. So the middle voice between active and passive, between male and female, that concept, that is what makes civilization possible. And then he goes on to say, the Athenians cherished it as the ground of philosophy and politics, the potential for our most searching powers of self-diagnosis, but it is lost on us moderns.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We crass and macho Americans have far more in common with Spartan polarization of soft and hard, the militarization of all life. So maybe that's what he would offer as the psychological underpinning of some of this, that we've self-victimized ourselves by stratifying so severely and not coming to the middle path here, which is, again, just the wisdom of the ancients. I mean, I have a very Buddhist background, and I just think of the Buddha, the middle way, the
Mm-hmm.
middle path was a huge cornerstone of that practice. So here it is echoed, and perhaps that answers your question there.
Well, I think, it is very interesting, that middle way thing, but then I think he jumps, to a cultural kind of position where there really is something to be done about that middle way of what the experience is, because the self-victimization is not just what one is in, it's what one is presented in a confused way by the parents.
Mm-hmm.
This self-victimization is there, and somehow it kind of is let go, that whole matrix is being there. And when you talk about the ancient wisdoms and stuff like that, I think like the power of them is they're often not in explanation, but in experiences. That there are rituals, there are things that to learn one like into malehood, one has to experience what it is, and not be told, but to find it oneself, you know.
Yeah.
And that's a very different kind of position, I think.
There's a Hegel quote about Kant, which is hilarious. Hegel's criticism of Kant is that Kant is like that person who wants to learn to swim, but won't get in the water until after he already knows how to do it. He says Kant is over intellectualizing and is too abstract. He withdraws from the specificity of life because he wants to understand it before he's willing to let it touch him. He's afraid he'll get cooties from experiencing life without understanding it. But of course, the problem, as Kierkegaard said, is that although we have to live life forward, you're running into things that we haven't seen before and that we're not ready for. We can only understand it backwards. And so we can't insist that we have to understand first, or else we end up over abstractivizing. And that goes right to what you're saying about there's a lot of this that has to be experienced, that we can only understand it through the struggle of the experience itself. That gives us the opportunity to see our mistakes and to see the things that didn't go the way we expected them to, and revisit them and think again, I wonder if there's a different way to do this. I wonder if there's a better way to do this. So
yeah, because sorry, go ahead.
Your overall critique, I think, is appropriate for this one, because Daughters and Granddaughters is just it's a sampler. It's just a short riff he's doing on a couple of poems, and it sort of sets up the entire rest of this book. And this isn't a book yet that he's published, but these chapters that follow are going to do what you're asking for. They dig into gnosis versus noesis, the different ways in which the psychology of human beings works, and the different kinds of worlds that we create out of those psychologies. So this first one is sort of interesting because it touches on a bunch of intriguing things, but doesn't do justice to any of them, because that would take more time than he's got here.
Nice. Yeah, I think it's sort of like that thing about experience and understanding. We jump over experience, like you were saying about the thing about the swimming pool, like you can't swim until you know how to swim.
Right.
We jump over the experience and we jump to understanding. We jump to judgment rather than kind of like, being able to suffer, or what, the container of the unknown, the infinity of the possibilities,
Right.
And that understanding is a reflective afterthought, and it's, might help you remember not to go up this way or something like that, or there's something nice in that way or something like that, but it isn't the understanding.
Yes.
It's the experience, which is, I think, is like a Nietzsche kind of position,
Yeah. The same page that Dave pointed us to, a little further down the page, he talks about the distinction between pratein and pathein, the doing and the suffering. Pratein related to praxis, and pathein related to pathos. And praxis and pathos are the duality between them, the interrelationship between them, the fact that you can't just pick one and say this is going to be my life strategy, but you need them both. And they need to they need to work with each other and interpenetrate each other. This is something he comes back to over and over. Almost every essay makes a reference to, some form of one of those two verbs, if not both of them. So it goes to what you're saying. And I see Daniel in the chats reference the when intellectuals die, they go to lectures about heaven instead of heaven. That's a quote. Lessing was defined an academic as someone who, given a choice of two doors, one labeled paradise, the other labeled lectures on paradise, will always choose the lectures on paradise. and I can't remember if it was Nietzsche or who said all academics are honorary Germans because they want the lecture first. So I don't want to do it.
When I first heard that, it was libertarians were the butt of the joke.
Right. Yeah, it comes from Lessing, and
Okay.
I can't remember if it was Hegel or Kierkegaard or Nietzsche. One of those guys quoted him.
It sounds like the guy who doesn't want to learn to swim until
Kant. Yes, Hegel's critique of Kant.
Yeah,
It's like, and it's understandable. It's one of the things that people struggle with when they become very, very good at something. The better you are at doing one thing, the harder it is to start at the bottom of the learning curve with something else. It's like after that feeling of being so competent and so effective in the thing that you're good at, do you really want to feel like a blithering idiot and an incompetent at some new thing at which you would be revealing that you are not actually a divine presence of who's perfected all things, but instead are still stumbling through life like the little kid who trips on his own feet? There's a humiliation associated with learning. A willingness
I had a film school teacher who said, you have to learn these rules so you'll know how to break them.
And
I think that's values. When he talks about values, I think a value is like to go in, that sure, there's pleasure in kind of mastering something, but you've gone away from the value, from the experience, because the experience is only being dropped in the infinity of the experience. And that, to me, that's a value. That's a value I can say, yes, I believe in that value.
Yeah. The polarization he's talking about here is we see it all over the place, and it's certainly between gnosis and noesis, these two mindsets that Hegel talks about, and that the Greeks talked about. It's natural.
Can you define them, or
sure? So gnosis, Gnosis, is the immersive experience of things. It's a way of knowing that's based on being immersed in reality and letting reality tell you what's true. Nice. And it often involves not understanding what's happening to you, and yet being able to describe it clearly because it is in fact happening to you, and because you're paying attention to what you're suffering. There's a lot of pathos and pathein, it comes into play here, associated with gnosis. It's like what happens with a master potter when they're amazing with the clay, because for 50 years or 60 years or 70 years, it's been them and the clay and the wheel, and all the brilliant ideas they had when they were first starting out got crushed by the experience of what the clay will or won't do. And so gradually, reality has knocked a kind of concrete understanding into them that they could never get in school, or by theorizing, or by building abstract systems of reason. You see this in the Hegelian term, Begriff. I'm gonna put both of these in the chat. So in the phenomenology of Geist, the phenomenon of the mind, Hegel he sets up a dialectic between two opposing modes of thought, and you're going to see this all over the place in Kierkegaard and in Smith. And you'll also see it in Arendt and other writers who are influenced by Hegel. And it's the idea, Begriff is the kind of thinking you do when you're thinking about an actual experience you've had, right? So you smell chai tea, and suddenly you're a little kid in your mom's kitchen 50 years ago. You're taken right back, and the look and feel of the place comes back to you. It has a tangible reality. And if she did it on a regular basis, the things that you learned about how to make chai tea don't come from theory, they come from the practice, because you know what it tastes like when you add too little sugar or too much sugar, or you steep it too long or not long enough. You have a suffering pathos style understanding that's very realistic, because it's real. It's not simulating reality through a system. It was what came from living through it. And when we engage in that kind of thinking about the world, we're engaging in gnosis, right? And the kinds of thoughts that we generate in Greek, those are called nomons, and this is called gnostic. Greek has all of this great way of deriving words from saying this is the noun that is the product of this process, or this is the noun that is the process that created this product. They have all these suffixes they can use to show the relationship between things and where they came from and what generated them and so on. Completely missing in English. We're just fumbling around in the dark trying to throw sentences together with something that was never meant to do this. So the other pair, other than gnosis and Begriff, is noesis and Verstand. I put them in like that. And noesis is abstractivizing logical, rational thinking. That's where instead of instead of thinking about the feel of the soil in your hands while you're gardening and why you don't plant the carrots too close together because of what happened last time you did it, you're instead trying to make up systems of abstract logic that would explain how carrots ought to grow, whether they do or not. You're like, I think carrots are like this. I've put carrots in this category. Carrots are root vegetables. And in my garden, I'm going to have a section that's for root vegetables. And I'm going to put all of the root vegetables together there. And I think that based on the flavor or the color or what have you, all the things that grow green should be to the left and all the things that grow purple should be to the right. And you start to invent these systems and categories, and you sort of impose your will upon the information that's there, and you generate a tremendous amount of information just through logical conclusions, right, from the premises that you have. So the law and mathematics, the ways most governments work, the way that social climbing works in highly structured environments like universities or corporations, the way that money and finance works, all of these things are noetic. They're all based on noesis and the noetic style of thinking. Hegel called this kind of a thought. When you think that kind of a thought, like E equals mc squared, when you think E equals mc squared, it is not a begriff. You never felt the texture of E equals mc squared on your tongue, in your mouth, right? You never had E equals mc squared knock things into your head through repeated experience and trial and error. You instead memorized it, and you put it as part of a system of relationships. You think about it abstractly and then impose that abstraction upon the world to try to cram the world into the kind of frame that E equals mc squared offers. And so a Verstand is that kind of a thought. And you see the difference between a begriff and a Verstand. The Verstand feels powerful. I mean, when I'm remembering the smell of chai in my mom's kitchen, it doesn't apply to anything except that experience. It's more true, but it's more limited in scope. There are things I could derive from it. I might be able to make my own pot of chai tea, but it's not going to tell me all people with the following characteristics are bad and should be killed, or that I should organize a government like this. It doesn't have the reach that Verstand has. But the danger of the reach of Verstand is that it's not true. It feels compelling because it's so far reaching and it's so internally coherent and systematic, but it's divorced from concrete experience and reality. And so as a result, if someone lives too much by Verstand, they could find themselves making death camps and rounding up all the Jews and killing them, because their logic tells them this is the thing we should do. We should purify our nation. We should remove the foreign elements, right? Isn't purity better than contamination? We don't want to be contaminated. So we're gonna purify, and these are the steps we have to do to purify, and it'll all be industrialized, and we'll have little computers with little numbers for the people. And it's like all this stuff is systematized thinking. It's all Verstand. And so Hegel said, to abstract is to be in error. That Verstand is dangerous. We need it. It's part of us. It's part of how we see the world, but we can't fetishize it and deify it because it can lead us into great evil. So that's kind of this wrestling match that you're going to see going on all the time in this and all the other essays that Kenneth Smith does. He's going to be drawing off of Hegel and this dialectic between these two modes of thought that the brain, that we're born with, that we evolved into, that are capabilities within us, right? That we can do both things, and we do both things. But as the Red Queen said, who's to be the master? How are we going to resolve? What's our life strategy for which one we're going to say is in service to the other one? How are we going to approach the world? This is really core to Kenneth Smith's philosophy, just like it was core to Hegel and Kierkegaard.
Now, I can think of, taking the, I'm going to forget your terms, but the more Gestalty, the chai tea one,
the griff gnosis,
and bringing that and saying, in the abstract one, there's motivations, there's something that is forming, the system of where one is proceeding, and that I could see how one then can take that chai thing and bring that to the abstract thing to broaden the possibilities and stuff like that. But yes. I'm thinking, does it go in reverse? Can you bring the abstract thing to the other thing?
Yes.
I'm not sure.
Yes, because if you had this wonderful experience with chai tea, and it might be that you would find other teas interesting, or it might be that you would be interested in cooking, or it might be that you would form a shop at Pike Place Market that specializes in rare teas from across the world and sell them to other people and introduce them to the wonder. You might have a lot of organized jars with little labels that tell you the species and what kinds of uses you can make. That there are ways to noesify to noesify Nozick experiences and knowledge. You can systematize from the concrete, and that's one of the things that Hegel recommends. He's like, you need to put these two things together because gnosis adds the grounding and the reality that noesis lacks, and noesis adds the reach and the systematization that gnosis lacks. To be a whole person, you have to find a middle way that brings the two together so their strengths help each other, and not just slip into being one or the other. This is where Kenneth Smith gets his characterology of Banausoi and Douloi and Aristoi, is from this Hegelian gnosis, noesis, and the third way, that the middle voice that puts the two together.
Yeah, I think of that the Chai way is kind of like self, and your description of the other way as a reach makes me wonder if it's about other people too. That the Chai tea way kind of is just about self, in there in a way, and the other way maybe has a potential about a reach to other people, and which brings a different reality, when there's more than one person.
Yeah, what they can do is they approach this from a different angle, so from each other. So the Nozick experience of life is immersive. The self is very present, but it's present in a way that's very sensitive to the world around it. When he's describing the infant, his daughter or granddaughter in this, who's so immediately responding to the world around her, right? She's, the way she squirms, the way she giggles, the way she's like a live wire, directly interacting with reality. Reality has her completely. It's a pathos, a suffering, and suffering doesn't mean bad, but it's a suffering in the sense that her will is not engaged separately from her experience of life. Her will is not saying, I don't care what I feel, I don't care what I see, I'm going to write this manifesto on philosophy, for example, right? Which is a very noetic thing to do, to say, I'm going to distance myself from the experience of life, and I'm going to use that distance to do something abstract that's not directly related to the experience of life. So when it comes to other people, either one of these mindsets can respond to other people, but a Nozick response is going to be very immersive. You're going to be very attuned to the people and how they make you feel and how you make them feel. The feedback loop is very tight, the stimulus response loop. You're in that relationship. Whereas a noetic approach to other people, you're stepping back. You might be smiling and talking to them, but you're not fully engaged because part of you is busy cataloging them and saying, oh, I see that he likes chocolate. I'll have to remember to get him chocolate on his birthday. That's something that, to be able to do that in the middle of the conversation is a noetic thing to do, because you've created a distance from the experience of the person that you're having right now. A Nozick person could remember to get this guy chocolate for his birthday, but he wouldn't think of it then. He would think of it later, right? Because right now he's in the experience with the person. He's fully engaged. Like an infant is fully engaged.
I think of it in a slightly different way. So,
yeah, sure.
So the Nozick person is in, the immersed state, in the wholeness,
yes.
and is just a part of the wholeness, but the resonating, holographic kind of experience and stuff. Where the other way, has, if rather than it being the same person doing that, someone else is doing it to you, and that shocks one with a reality that is different than one's own, and that offers like, you know, a very profound experience, you know, that it's coming from the other direction at you. You know, it breaks up. It offers something that one has not, doesn't even feel the resonance in one's own wholeness. It's something else, you know, it's a different tone.
Yes. Everything feels completely different from these two mindsets. That use of the term tone that you just did, Kenneth uses that all the time too. He's like, both of these people are going through their life, the ultra gnosic people and the ultra noetic people, but life feels completely different to them. It has a different tone. Everything has a different meaning. How you interpret the world is completely different from these two mindsets. And it's one of the challenges that we have as moderns is that when we try to understand the human condition and human psychology, we have a tendency to slip into one of two fallacies. Fallacy number one is we're all the same. We're all equal. We all see the world the same way. But it's obviously not true, because we can see, especially in psychopaths and politicians, we can see people making choices that we would never, ever, ever make. But those choices make sense to them, right? So they clearly have different value systems. They clearly experience the world differently than we do. So we can see that it's not true that we're all the same. But the other fallacy that moderns slip into is saying, oh, then we're all different. No two people are the same. We're all little snowflakes. But that's not true either. That's just another way of saying don't bother looking at the structure of human psychology, because there's nothing to see there. Everyone's a one-off. You can study people as individuals and enjoy them or not, but you know, there's no bigger picture. They're both designed to defeat the attempt to understand why we do the things we do. And so what Hegel and Kierkegaard and Smith are doing here is saying, actually, there's a structure to the way that people think. And the way that people think and visualize the world causes them to fall into a very limited set of patterns. And those patterns are not, it's not like we're Xerox copies of each other. It's more like we have certain frames and filters that cause us to experience the world one way or another way, or maybe a third way. That there are habits that we slip into that become like strange attractors, centers of gravity for the way that we think. We can vary off of whatever our type is, but sooner or later we're going to go back to home base, because that's our comfort zone for how we interpret the world and how we think about ourselves and so forth. And what Hegel and Kierkegaard and Smith and others want us to do is to learn what those are, so that we don't keep blundering our way through life, misunderstanding each other, and not be coming up with good plans for how to make a better world. You know, I grew up in some dysfunctional families. You know, I went through some abuse that I suffered. There was alcoholism, there was mental illness, there was emotional abuse, there were a lot of other things. And one of the things that you learn when you're emerging from, say, an alcoholic family or an abusive family is that there's a tremendous amount of work done to normalize what's unhealthy and make it seem like there's nothing happening, right? There's a lot of enabling and codependent work that's done to erase the problem and make it unthinkable, so that the problem can continue. That it becomes a fear that rocking the boat would be the worst thing. The worst thing that could happen is if our shame were exposed to the public and people could point and say, oh my God, those people, look what they did. And so you get this culture of secrecy, and the secrecy goes to not just hiding from others, but from hiding from yourself, to sort of role playing that everything's fine. Daddy doesn't have a problem, right? We don't talk that way. Everything, if we can all just agree that everything's fine, then nothing has to change. And that's what, you know, that's what happens in society when society develops abusive qualities. When you get an abusive society where some people are preying upon others, that same dynamic of let's not talk about the abuse. Let's pretend that we're all the same. Nobody here is thinking to themselves, I wonder how I can take all of that guy's money. I wonder how I can sabotage the savings and loan in order to put all that money in my bank account and take it away from all these retirees. Let's pretend that's not happening, and pretend that there aren't people who think that way and are going to act upon that. And as long as we play along with that role playing of the codependent enabler role in sort of a society-wide abusive relationship, we can't fix things. It's not until we can say, you know, different people see the world differently, and some of those differences are just fine, they're just cultural differences, they're diversity, and that's all interesting. But some of those differences are some people look at the world as predators and prey and think that they're the predators. And if we don't recognize that, and if we can't talk clearly about that, if we don't understand why that happens, why do they see the world that way? Why does that make sense to them? And why do people like that keep cropping up throughout history? Going back to Sharon's point about the repetition of history, then we're going to be stuck in cycles and keep repeating these mistakes over and over.
Well, but I think here, it isn't just, you're labeling it as, the abusive, alcoholic kind of family. I think it's not. I think it's all families. Maybe there's an exception or two in humanity's history, but I don't believe it. I believe that that's there in everyone. And that the thing is the habits, what's considered comfortable is comfortable in a self-victimization, a hiding kind of way. And it's actually all the comforts, all the places that we hide in, because we hide from the terror that's within there and don't use the middle voice to look at that. So the value is to find all the comforts, all the places, because they are the locus of a problem that we don't see. And so it's the same model of the alcoholics, but it's ubiquitous in the structure of raising, especially in the West, of how a child is raised. It's there.
I think Smith would agree with you, and I do too. It's a different way of saying the same thing, in the sense that it focuses on a different part of the problem that you're right is important not to overlook, and that is, someone who has slipped into a banausic mindset, who has become a banausos, who thinks noetically far more often than they think nosically. It's not that they're an alien form of intelligence. That capacity for noesis is in all of us. We all engage in noesis. It's part of how the mind works, and it's a no one, as far as I can tell from reading Hegel and Kierkegaard and Smith, nobody is born a banausos and just naturally engages all the time in noetic thinking, because noesis, the abstraction and distancing that's involved in doing that, is something you can only learn over time, because the natural experience that we're born into is so nosic, so immersive. Like he talks about here, the infant is born just live wire connected to reality. And the people who grow into a banausic mindset or way of life, they do so through a process of separating themselves from the way that they began. And the same is true of Aristoi. The middle voice, you sort of can't just go right to it. You're not born right into it. That the heuristic mindset and life way is a mindset of struggling against yourself, questioning yourself, looking at your own ulterior motives and your own subconscious choices, and that doesn't come naturally to a doulos, to anybody when they're born, and it also doesn't come naturally to a banausos, because that's not what they did when they separated themselves from their doulic instincts, from the way that they were born. And so all of these things are things that, like you say, that it has to do with capacities that are in all of us. It has to do with behaviors and mindsets that are in all of us. And it has to do with, are we comfortable with, or at least willing to engage in what AA calls the searching and fearless moral inventory that so often turns up all the terrible things we've done that we don't want to take responsibility for, right? Sharon, I saw you had your hand up.
I like we're on page 8, where he said where Smith said what I think you're articulating. He said, I believed from long before a first child that as little can be done with a child as can be done to him, with and to being in parentheses. A fresh life can only be left to unfold for better or for worse, according to its own secret laws.
Yes.
So, I think every family has dysfunctionality. But it's that secret law in the individual that allows you to be functional or not. And if there are many siblings in a family, and this is just practice here, and I have 2 siblings, and we're very close together, all in the same family, but our perception of events, now that we're in our 60s and 50s, we're so different.
Yeah. Yeah, that thing that parents talk about how
the secret laws.
Yeah, that children, we can't see it when they're first born, but that children grow into becoming, in hindsight, you can look back and go, I guess they always were like the fastidious child who always wants to wash their hands after they, get dirty. I have a nephew who was hilarious because he wanted to eat the sweet things, but he hated stickiness. And so literally he'd take a bite of the sweet thing and then he'd hold up his hands and cry until you washed his hands. And then he'd reach for the next piece again because he both wanted to be clean and also to pick up the sticky thing at the same time. When he was a little boy, we bought him a toy vacuum cleaner for his birthday so that he would stop grabbing the real one and trying to run it around the house. You can't make this stuff up, right? I mean, this kid was born with this drive that could unfold and express itself over time as he grew older. The parents didn't make him do that and couldn't have stopped him from doing it if they tried. This is just who he is coming out and unfolding itself over time.
And I think too, though, it's a direction,
Yeah.
So it isn't about cleanliness and stuff. It's a potentiality
Yes.
that actually can lead to unknownness and richness. And it's someone who has a particular vertus on something that's possible through that particular thread, that it's rich. And it's not to be kind of like stopped and labeled. It's just a direction, and it's to be encouraged and stuff like that, in my thinking.
Right. Yeah, what the parents are actually doing with the child is hard to put into words. They don't make the child. They don't mold them. Although so many parents try. You don't stamp out the child like a little Xerox of your best parts and say, "There, I've succeeded as a parent." There's something unfolding. There's a direction. What the Greeks called a teleology, right? That one of the qualities of nature is that things, whether we can see it or not, whether we can map it out or not, whether we understand it or not, things have their own internal conflicts and directions, and they are going to work to resolve those conflicts and create those directions. And the best we could do is sort of follow along afterwards and go, "Oh, is that what he wanted to be?" And try to keep them from falling off a cliff in the meantime.
Yes.
I have to say that particular paragraph that Sharon just pointed out on page 8
Yeah.
is in its entirety absolutely fantastic. And I
Yes.
think it demonstrates something that Ken Smith does so well, is he moves between these critiques so seamlessly. So in that paragraph, he's talking about the child, and you can't do with as opposed to to, and we're all a product of our acculturation. And then he goes right after that, all the spectacle and virtuality of our culture is just so much distraction from the soulish peace and quiet, that our culture is actually designed to distract us from ourselves.
Yes.
Because in this power mad world, we have to crush and reset lives. We can't allow people to have their own individuality in some certain respect. Not that we can't, maybe the power structure doesn't allow it.
Right.
And it uses culture in this perverse way to distract us from ourselves. I mean, that is just such a powerful revelation. And then just after that, talking about what anyone cannot see is because he cannot respect that very idea. If you can't see it, it's because you can't respect it. And that respect is not just respecting what someone says, but it's the entire culturation of that person is where true respect actually comes from. I mean, we're only halfway through this paragraph. I mean, and then I think that no true understanding without values, in italics, no values without love, is really a profound statement.
Oh, yeah.
Just fascinating.
I never this essay is the very first time in my life, despite all the reading I've done of Kenneth Smith's stuff, that I ever found him boiling down much of his philosophy to these two statements. And when I read them, the hair went up on the back of my neck, because everything I'd ever read of Kenneth Smith suddenly came into that focus. I said, oh my God, there it is.
I was just saying in chat earlier with someone, and I think it's so true. I mean, there was a comment in chat at the beginning of the talk about progress, and I was saying that differentiating genuine progress between progress for its own sake and a part of genuine progress, I thought there would have to be a moral component to it, that we're not just doing things because we can, but because they actually have a moralistic component that enriches our lives in some way beyond purely materialistic. And here he is saying that no true understanding without values. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth in a culture that sort of praises scientific understanding, especially now with the vaccine coming and this praise of science. And I'm not denigrating that. It's just so fascinating how the moral aspect is totally absent in popular culture and popular communications, whether it's news or entertainment or whatever it is. And he's really putting his finger on this issue. I just think it's so critical.
I wonder if you could comment on him talking about going on farther in that paragraph where he talks about Faust's foolish bargain.
Yes.
I am always interested in Faust, right? Yes. Because he props up in so many other things. Because in that bargain, Faust always loses.
Yeah. I don't know how many people have read at least a summary of Goethe's Faust, but boy, is it worth your time, because many subsequent writers and thinkers have said that Goethe's Faust is the best thing that was ever written in German. It's up there with Shakespeare, right? Oh, Walter Kaufmann. You not only have Faust, you have the Faust. Kaufmann's great translation of Faust. He knows what I'm talking about. So, to understand modernism is very hard for a modern, because it's the water we fishies are swimming in. I don't remember who it was who said, I don't know who discovered water, but we can be sure it wasn't fish, because whatever you're so familiar with, you take for granted and can't realize that it's a thing, that it's a medium, and that it could be affecting you. And so for moderns, the hardest thing in the world is to understand what it means to be modern. How are we different from previous epochs? How do we see differently and conceive differently and relate to one another differently? This is like the big nescience, the big lacuna, the blind spot in the modern world, is that we don't know ourselves. And so when we find potent encapsulations of the heart of modernism, we have to cherish them as little touch points we're going to need over and over to come back to remind ourselves as we stumble through the dark. Oh yeah, this is where I am. And Kenneth Smith has a couple of those touch points, and one of them is Pico della Mirandola, his essay on human dignity, which is basically the first clear statement of the modernist proposition that we should organize the world according to human reason instead of according to nature or gods. It's like that thing I talked about a month ago about the three epochs being distinguished by how they prioritize among God, nature, and man. Pico della Mirandola, he just lays it out there and says, yeah, it's people. People need to make these choices. We need to choose what's important. We need to self-organize. And, the divine and the nature and the natural world should just organize around us. We're like gods. Mirandola, that whole, the power of reason and how amazingly creative people are. And so, we will be the ones to decide how everything is, what matters and how things are going to be organized. Mirandola just lays it out there. And so Smith cites him like every other essay. In trying to understand modernism, you have to go back to Mirandola. But another place you have to go to, and that Smith takes us to over and over, and that Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Hegel is Goethe, is Faust. This centerpiece of Faust's bargain and what he thinks he can do, and how Mephistopheles, who always fools people by telling them the truth and giving them what they want, and then it turns out that it wasn't better for them to get what they wanted, right? There's Heraclitus all over Mephistopheles. It's not better for people if they get what they want. He says, okay, Faust, we'll take this bargain. I bet you can't remain detached and abstract and systematic and intellectual and all-knowing without something somewhere in your immortal life drawing you in to become so attached that you break the bargain, and then I can have your soul. And so this whole thing is the struggle to live a Banausic life, to think and relate to the world entirely noetically. This is part of the power of the character of Spock in Star Trek, is that Vulcans live that way, detached, right? That was what Goethe was trying to do. And some of the most interesting writing in the original Star Trek wrestles with the fact that he's only half human, half Vulcan. He's got this part of him that feels, and he's trying to maintain his detachment even though he doesn't want to. And that makes him more like us. When we try to be Banausic, when we try to be intellectual and noetic, we're struggling against that nosic begriff part of us that wants to immerse in life and be connected the way that Goethe ultimately ended up doing and losing his bargain on. So Sharon, yeah, that's what Faust is doing right here in the middle of this paragraph, is that the idea that there could be no true understanding without values is what Mephistopheles was betting when he took Goethe's a proposition and said, sure, go ahead and try to understand the world without values and without love. Try not to attach, because you won't be able to do it. And being a diabolical but immortal, and therefore in some ways wiser person than a mortal, I can see coming the end of this story. Goethe's outcome is fated, and it's fated by his character.
Rick, I totally appreciate your earlier comment about Kenneth's use of language and how precise it is. It just in that, just one more sentence later there, he talks about our fantasy world of murderous and asphyxiating objectivity.
Yes.
Which I think is just such a brilliant description. And you can see that, I mean, if you just want to generalize to that objective mindset that just sees, puts profit ahead of people, just looks at a spreadsheet instead of a community, just makes decisions in a boardroom as opposed to on the ground where things are actually happening. And what we were talking about in the chat, I think this reflects back to, can we have understanding without experience, and then the danger of misreading the map for the territory. It all really intertwines. I mean, it's just, he's just so on the money with these. I mean, every sentence could be a book almost, really.
Yeah. It's like that goes back to my answer to Sharon about what drew me to Kenneth Smith. It's if you look for equally potent stuff, you look at places like Heraclitus, where Heraclitus, in 3 words, ethos anthropoi daimon, character is fate. And in that sentence, he sums up the relationship between free will and determinism, and the struggles that we have to do in life to overcome the character we're born with and try to be better people. And how if we don't cultivate our character to be better than it is now, then our dysfunctional character is going to lead to a dysfunctional life. And that there's implications about people who are too outward looking and don't ever do that introspection, who don't study themselves and try to cultivate their character, and what's going to happen in their lives. Like the whole history of tragedies that are written about, the excess of a virtue becoming a tragic flaw and leading to the downfall of a heroic person. All that stuff comes right out of those 3 words. That was like a nexus of Greek wisdom. And like you said, it would take multiple books in that case to fully unpack those 3 words, because they're so potent. And that's part of what drew me to Kenneth Smith's philosophy, is that even though he always uses more than 3 words, because he's trying to knit so many things together. Nevertheless, I find that if I'm really trying to say the same thing and not lose any essential meaning, it takes me more words. It's about as dense as it can go. And that's just refreshing after a diet of banality and dullness and all the cheap, empty things that were offered so much in the marketplace. To read somebody really coming to grips with the core questions.
But I think today we're living, our society is the recipient of the Faustian bargain that we made in a political sense.
We did.
And I can see that.
Yeah.
And in economic sense, I would say as well. pursuing
Okay.
economic growth purely for its own merit, not realizing that when a hurricane destroys a village, the rebuilding is a GDP positive. That's actually economic growth. Do you want that? No, no one wants that. But our model rewards that.
It does.
And that's this objectifying, this Spock-like analytical mentality that we have to sort of realize is murderous and asphyxiating, exactly as he said. I
Yes,
mean, I
yes.
cannot say it better than he said it. It really is incredible.
Yeah, it's potent stuff. He's, you know, when you get into his emails, there's going to be times when he's just writing off the cuff and he's not quite as tuned up. But when he's writing about something he's really passionate about, so that it really springs off his keyboard, or if it's something that he was able to go back to over and over and tune up as much as he could, he's got a way with words. He pulls things together. So I really like the very next sentence when he says, by its very concept, uncaring life is not worth living. This goes hand in hand with the other thing he says, where value-free information is worthless. He's like, the things that we uphold as the pinnacle of professionalism, right? It's nothing personal. How many times you hear in stories somebody, or in reality, somebody explains a disaster as saying, it's nothing personal. I just had to do this because the numbers told me I had to do it. And yet they think that's an excuse, because for them, because they have abstracted themselves from the immediate experience of life, they can go ahead and just, you know, say, well, it was a matter of the numbers. We decided not to fix the car, and that it was better to settle the lawsuits that come from it car exploding and killing people. Look at the numbers.
For
They tell us
example,
what to do.
we decided to
Pintos.
keep the economy open because it was worth it when you look at the numbers versus the number of people that would die, right?
Yeah.
That's an abstraction in the same way that you
It's
just
exactly
mentioned.
the same. It's exactly the same. And, you know, he comes back also over and over to a related issue of false consciousness. You know, Marx uses the term false consciousness, but it goes all the way back to Heraclitus and before, the idea of sleepwalking through life and not actually knowing your circumstances, having a model for reality that's so disjoint from what you're actually experiencing that you make choices that are not in your self-interest, that you think are in your self-interest, because your model of the world is so wrong. And he talks about the way that is deployed strategically by Banalsoy to hide the true motivations, to make it seem as though they have the interests of the douloi at heart. We're just trying to do the right thing, and that's why we did this. But then when when Exxon accidentally, their emails get leaked, and then you see the executive saying, well, we know that what we're doing might lead to the catastrophic collapse of the world climate, but the profits are just too good, right? But then that's not what they said publicly. So that whole issue of the way that a Banalsos can recognize that even though for them it's true that they should destroy the world climate in order to make money, they don't think they would get away with it if they admitted it to people. And so they deploy words as little weapons and tools to manufacture a false consciousness among the population at large that says, oh no, we're a green company. We love the world, and we invest. Look how much money we give to charities that take care of the environment. We really care about the environment. This is really the best thing to do. Well, at the same time, not believing a word of it. That detachment.
Well, I think there's like another kind of angle though.
Yeah, sure.
It's important not to kind of like create these others, that they are making these decisions based off of this thing that we can see, because the truth is we can't see. We don't know really what's going on with them because they don't really know,
Right.
They're trapped and they're in suffering. And I feel like the caring thing that we speak of as a value is caring about everybody and understanding that all the diluted things are based off of a suffering, a horrendous suffering, and that's the caring that that's the value, and that always has to be in there, because it's just so seductive to label somebody else doing something wrong as the morality, rather than the ethics of a caring and understanding that we're all kind of this, from the same kind of position. And I
Right.
think, that's how it goes back to me, that we're all deluded because, it's an intergenerational confusion that we're delivered
Right.
because our parents had no idea what was going on because it's so generationally back.
Right.
Patrick, I think that is such a great point. And, nothing sort of uh, is more disheartening than you see good people who are angry at another group of people just because they are perceived as the other, and it brings me back to some of my Buddhist sort of conceptions. The Buddha talked about anger. Grasping onto anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intention of throwing it at someone else.
Yes.
That you are the one that gets burned by
Yes.
grasping onto that. And so by extending that caring to everyone and understanding through compassion, another Buddhist concept, that we're all a part of that, as this culture or this one-mindedness or this water that we're living in that we can't really explain. We're all a part of that. And so that's why we can have compassion for a sociopathic individual or someone who is, doing, we would perceive as the other, because really there is no other.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's such a great point that you make and really important to keep in mind.
That's right. Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, I mean that all these capabilities that we're talking about that can be misused are in all of us, and that we misuse them too. It's a natural thing to do this, which is why so many people do it.
I may sort of play.
Hi, Dowdy.
Hi, hello. Play sort of like a devil's advocate. I don't know if I really call it a devil's advocate. So I forget which part in the essay, but Kenneth Smith makes the distinction between persuasion and coercion, and I think he alludes to the Greek god Pathos, or the Greek goddess, sorry, like Pathos, and sort of the idea that like persuasion comes when you've sort of taken a step back and sort of understood. I think Dave, you said it correctly, the compassion component of it. But like yeah. So I wonder though, and as what Patrick was saying, and this is sort of a question directed to you as well, Patrick. Does sort of looking at people through the lens of compassion as opposed to looking at them through like, oh, I told you so, or just sort of like talking down to them, is that supposed to lead to a different way of moving them to do good or right? I suppose. I don't know if we want to word that, because like, let us say like you look at the United States of America and sort of race relations, right? And you sort of look at white America and their predicament, and I'm sure like a tons of Black people have done scholars on it, and sort of like the way that race is reflected is sort of a type of despair. Like they're kind of eating themselves by being racist towards the other. And like, so as Black people, are we supposed to do the old sort of, or like anybody of any minority group, I shouldn't just make this a part of that, but we do the old sort of like forgiven sort of like, let's hold hands and sing Kumbaya because they'll get over it eventually. And if we just like show that we're happy and we can sing in rivers, it'll be fine. Or are we supposed to like go out and be like, no, you guys are wrong. Like, to hell with compassion. We got to switch this because we're all suffering under it in a sense. Like, how much compassion can we have before it just becomes like you're not really doing anything because you just love them too much in a sense?
Can I say that maybe those two are not mutually exclusive, that you could have compassion for someone, but also let them know that their behavior is wrong, that's not, you don't have to choose between the two. And I think your message would be, they would be more receptive if you told them what they were doing is wrong with compassion than with anger, for example, whereas that's just going to cause them to be angry at you, and then there's no productive conversation that can be had. So maybe that's a false dichotomy in some sense. Maybe there's no such thing as too much compassion. I don't know. That's probably my own personal bias.
Well, I think it's like the compassion is the thing that leads to that middle voice, the questioning of oneself, to a place where one does not know, and that's the important kind of component. It isn't compassion for what they're doing. It's a compassion to understand that I don't know what I'm doing. And if I can kind of understand, I don't know what I'm doing, I can understand they don't know what they're doing. They're unaware because they're trapped in, you know, things that are safe. You know, they're little holds that they're in, you know, little defensive positions, but they don't realize it's a defensive position, you know.
And that we're all a product of our environment as well, having compassion for that.
I think Dowdy puts his finger on something interesting here. Yeah, I do a lot of reading and studying of BIPOC and LGBTQ and other writers. I one of the things that comes up frequently is the way that white people really don't want black people to get angry with them. It doesn't matter how many people we enslaved or murdered or how much we destroyed Africa or any other place. We're like, but that's not my fault. You should still be loving towards me. And the fact that, you know, I wouldn't own this house and I wouldn't have had this education, I wouldn't have this great job if it weren't for my ancestors, you know, raping Africa and keeping slaves. I don't want to talk about that. I will not acknowledge that. I don't want to recognize any part of it. I want you to treat it as though we're all starting at the starting gate together equally right now, and that there's really nothing you should be angry about. I think there's a similar, and it's something we have to watch out for when we're sort of exploring these issues. Is it's a natural tendency for people of privilege to slip into, to expect that people who've been marginalized need to cater to how we feel about the subjects that they're bringing up. When the truth is, whoever has had the short end of the stick is the one who should be catered to emotionally the most, because they've had the short end of the stick. They have more reason to be angry, and their life has sucked more. So they need more compassion right now than the people who, although their life wasn't perfect and there's plenty of things that have gone wrong, you know, I was never denied a job because I'm white. I was never, you know, I never had cops following me because I'm white. I know when a cop pulled me over, I never had to wonder if I was going to die right now in the next 5 minutes because I'm white. You know, there's a level of stress that I don't experience because of my position of privilege. And so as a result, I think it's incumbent upon me to extend a great deal more latitude towards people who do have to put up with that and the anger that they feel because of the stress they're under. Because I don't behave well when I'm angry. You know, I'm not going to express myself most eloquently. I'm not going to, you know, my compassion won't be fine-tuned. I'm stressed, right? It's a thing. I think of Robert Axelrod here. I think there's two things I can say that I think will really help this discussion.
Are you going to bring up The Evolution of Cooperation?
Well, damn yeah.
Fucking fantastic book.
Fucking fantastic book. Let me put that in the chat right now. Robert Axelrod. It's short. It's sweet. Everybody should read it.
Okay.
It's one of the best things. It's just one of the best things. So what he did here is he got involved with people doing studies on when do people cooperate well together and when don't they, and why. He was trying to figure out what are the preconditions that make it possible for people to constructively engage with each other. And also, what are the conditions that make it impossible for people to constructively engage with each other? And based on his studies, I mean, Dave knows what all the stuff I'm going to say. He could probably say some of it better than I can. But there's a couple of crucial takeaways. One of them is that we appear to be hardwired with a limbic switch, so that when we feel threatened enough, our behavior changes dramatically and our priorities change dramatically. If we think there's scarcity and we think we're not going to make it, or we think the people we love, who are our responsibility to take care of, are not going to make it, we become different people. It's in us. It's in our white matter in our brain to change modes. And not everybody will fall prey to this. I mean, somebody who knows they have this liability and who has trained themselves could avoid doing it, but it's a stress while they do it. Most people who haven't done this investigation on themselves, who haven't studied this thing, will deny that it's possible or that it's happening. And they'll just switch right over into being selfish and competitive and dangerous because they're kept in this mode of stress where they're afraid that they're going to lose the things that they need in order to survive. But if you can change those conditions, this is one of Robert Axelrod's amazing discoveries. If you could change those conditions so that people feel like there's enough, they feel like there's plenty, and that there's no point in hoarding, and that their loved ones are not in danger, and everything's going to be okay, the exact same person who yesterday was being a real shithead can turn around on a dime and start sharing what they've got. It is the most amazing thing to see, that these people are so powerfully, their whole worldview is powerfully modulated by this sense of threat, by whether their limbic system has been engaged. So the reason I bring that up is the modernist world order is predicated upon the idea that we must motivate people to be productive. And the way we motivate them is by threatening their existence. You could become homeless. You might not get health care. You might not get an education. You might not be able to buy food this week unless you labor, right? You have to work, 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 work in order to prove that you deserve to live. And what this does is, from a Robert Axelrod perspective, is it puts every American and people all over the world into a perpetual state of stress in which they always have their limbic switch thrown, and they're always ready to compete with each other when they could be cooperating. Even when it would be better for the world or for themselves or for their children and loved ones to cooperate, they can't because their switch is thrown. They're stuck in this fight or flight survival mode. And when you try to reason with somebody who's stuck in that mode, you're not actually talking to the best part of them. You're not talking to the most understanding part of them. There may not even be a trail of breadcrumbs of logic or persuasion or anything else that can get them from where they are to where they ought to be in order to make a better world. What happens as intellectuals, we have a tendency to think that problems can be solved intellectually through discussion and logic and reason. But one of the most powerful implications of what Axelrod is saying is, in many cases, there's no point in having an argument. You should just solve the immediate crisis for the person so that they move out of crisis mode. And now they're a whole different person to talk to. You see what I mean? It's like this goes beyond questions of compassion versus anger. This goes to when we are trying to solve problems to make a better world in conditions in which everybody is freaked out and stressed all the time, which is the modern condition. The deck has been stacked against us from the outset. So, it shades everything.
Quick comment. That's why UBI grows the economy like by 12%, because you get rid of that scarcity, floor that everyone is, everyone thinks, oh, you give people basic income, they're going to like blow it on crappy life choices. But no, that turns out they don't. It turns out they make better life choices because that scarcity flavor is taken away from their environment.
Right. So, I'm taking this class on Sunday mornings. It's called The Black Past, and it's a study of African history and prehistory. And it's also a study, this yesterday, oh God, I'm so glad I'm taking this thing. They did the first in a series on struggles against slavery, the attempts to stop the slave trade. And they covered not just the things we learn about in American history class, but they covered South America and the Caribbean, and they covered Africa, where African nations went to war against the slavers to try to shut down the slave trade. And literally, I learned none of this in school. I'm crazy for history. I continued studying history into college, and I never learned any of this. It's just been completely erased. And so you hear these stories of these amazing people who did these amazing things against all odds to shut down slavery, the revolts in Haiti, various revolts in Brazil that happened. And you think, if we were a country that loved freedom, wouldn't we tell the story of people who fought for freedom? Wouldn't every one of these just astonishing people, the books would be everywhere. There'd be kids' books, there would be movies, there'd be TV series about, the history of overthrowing slavery in Haiti, with these great heroes who maybe started out in horrible conditions, but said, this is not going to stand. I'm gonna organize with other people and we're gonna create freedom for everybody. Wouldn't a freedom-loving country be unable to stop telling these stories to each other? Wouldn't we all know these stories? But instead, we don't know any of these stories.
That's why I think Ken Smith's critique of culture is so valid, because we don't tell any of these stories, and I believe it's intentional to reinforce that scarcity system. They've been doing it in economics. It goes to Milton Friedman. It goes all the way back to Thomas Malthus, who's been wrong for 2 centuries, but people still, for some reason, love to talk about that, and that we're going to somehow run out of food or this type of thing to justify all of the competition to keep us out of cooperation, which is obviously the more optimal result. I just wonder, is obviously we're we were looping back on ourselves now, because understanding this isn't
Yes.
enough to break us out of it. We
Yes.
have to experience it. So I guess that's maybe the silver lining behind some of the crises that we're going through, socioeconomic, is that we're now experiencing it. So we get to the point where we can say, hey, we have to do something different.
Yeah. Go ahead, Sharon.
Well, I think the freedom is part of the myth, and we talked about that last week, right? Freedom is one of the myths that we have. And our current upheaval, I think, when we're talking about learning, we're making, and I hate to use the word mistakes, but where, until you almost lose something, you don't value what you have. And this experience we're having, I hope it will take us to a different place, a better place, as we're able to
Yes.
make different judgments.
Yes.
That's the whole exercise from this. And that's the way I see life. You make mistakes, and from those mistakes, you get experience. And out of that experience should come better judgments. And if it doesn't, then that says something about your character.
Right. Or the nature of the anti-culture that you're trapped in that prevents your character from developing the way that it should have.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
I think basically, this culture, we're all in this form of slavery, right? And how do you hide that fact? Freedom. We're for freedom.
We're all
it's
free.
just like totally, we're just slaves. I mean,
It's a
like
myth.
we're economic slaves. We're, ideological slaves. We're just in a slavery system.
Yes.
There's just
Yes.
no doubt. And yet, you hide that by saying we're about freedom. God dang it.
Right. We do it in a kind of a information-free way. We claim it and we jump up and down and yell about it. We go, freedom! And in this, every time someone sings the Star Spangled Banner, when the singer says the land of the free, there's cheers all over the audience. Yay, freedom! And yet we don't tell the story of any of these freedom fighters. It's like the stories we don't want spreading are how you actually get freedom. It's like, well, what does that tell us? It's like George Orwell was a prophet, right? That's what it tells us. So I come out of these classes every Sunday, and I look at how amazingly advanced Africa was, right? At the same time that in Europe, we couldn't keep a kingdom going for more than a few decades before, the next kingdom over wanted to take what they had and broke it back down again. There's constant toppling of kingdoms through the Middle Ages in Europe, as the sophisticated version of cavemen hitting each other over the head with stones is going on in Europe. At the same time that in Africa, just you wouldn't believe the stuff in this class. I mean, roads and plumbing and civilization and the equivalent of a UBI. Everybody has enough food to eat and they're all cooperating and doing artistic stuff. And yeah, there's the occasional war, but they happen like infrequently. And when they happen, often these whole confederations will rise up in whole regions of Africa to repel them. There's this sense of cooperation. And then you can see how once the Portuguese got hooked on slavery and it spread to the Spanish and then to the rest of Europe, they just destroyed all of this infrastructure. And I come out of it being so angry and disgusted with the history of Europe and European people. You can see the extent to which what Europe paints as a renaissance, in which Europe lifted itself up by its own bootstraps and became wise and left the Dark Ages and embraced science and wisdom and enlightenment and the dignity of man, and all this propaganda starts rising up in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s about how great Europeans are. And yet it was all funded by robbing Africa. It's shocking the extent to which the elephant in the room is such a big elephant, and yet absolutely nobody's allowed to mention it. It's like let's not talk about what's actually happening in front of us. It underscores this issue of how malleable is the human psyche. To what extent can we be inculcated with a false consciousness so that we can look right at a thing and not see it, like Heraclitus?
We're living it right now.
Yeah.
Maybe Ken Smith would say, because we've objectified culture, we've made it valueless. Mm-hmm. And maybe even a little worse.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I want to piggyback on something that you said. It's not just when the Europeans went to Africa, it's a whole process of colonization. Because if you go to South Africa and you go to Peru and you look at the sophistication of the Incas, and the Spanish came, and that whole sophistication was gone. And there's so many cultures throughout the world that when the Europeans arrived, those cultures went backward.
Yeah. Yeah. There's an extent to which modernism is not actually any kind of progress. It's a kind of piracy in which you go to cultures that have spent thousands of years developing an amazing volume of natural resources and cultural resources, and then you strip mine it as quickly as you can. And then when it's not valuable anymore, you move on to the next one. There's this kind of locusts thing. And when you look at sort of how many continents that was done to, it's easy to see why Europe experienced this kind of boom in its economy and in its arts and sciences. It was like money was pouring in. I'm always struck by the story about how the discovery of the New World and the exploitation of gold and slaves in the New World actually destroyed Spain's economy. All that influx of all that money caused a complete collapse where, money wasn't worth anything anymore. And they might as well have not done it at all and would have been better off than what they did to themselves.
That's practically a description of this whole vulture capitalism, corporate raider, like Bain Capital. It's like take on a bunch of debt, run up the stock value, fire everyone, and then dump it and run away with the profits, and that's like a very common, thing in capitalism these days. It's called vulture capitalism instead of venture capitalism. The derisive slang. That's not venture capitalism. That's vulture capitalism.
Yeah, that's right. So for me, this goes back to what Dowdy was asking is so how do you talk with people about this stuff? How do you talk about issues of justice and what we ought to do at a time when people don't actually understand what's happening and they're sort of in denial about what's right in front of their faces? And how do you have a conversation with somebody, for example, about reparations, not just towards African Americans, but towards, frankly, all of Africa and all Native Americans and Australian Aborigines and anywhere else we went, right? I mean, Europe sort of owes 500 years of reparations, more or less, to every other continent. But how can you have that conversation with people who don't know the history and they don't know what happened? They don't know how we got here or where we are.
Isn't this where compassion maybe comes in? Because I'm, just in the terms of Ken Smith, perhaps the racist or whoever the oppressor is has objectified the other, and that's how they're able to take advantage of them without any scruples, whereas they wouldn't do that presumably to a member of their own family, perhaps. Let's hope.
Some of them.
Yeah. So, in dealing with someone compassionately, doesn't that erode the level of objectivity that exists there, so that, you hear these examples of, I used to be in the KKK and then I was befriended someone and, whatever. You hear these examples of people who, an oppressor and oppressed, and then they get together, they find out, hey, we're just normal people. We both want our kids to be happy. We both, have to eat food. We're the same in so many ways. Our differences were so minor. And once we were able to pierce through that veil, I wasn't able to objectify that person anymore. So I guess that's where I think the compassion really comes into play. It's not about trying to absolve someone for, sins of our fathers or something like that. To me, it's about modeling the type of behavior and world that you want to inhabit and giving a demonstration to people who probably have never seen it before, so that they say, hey, that's what it looks like. That I can make that decision. I don't have to be just a product of my culture where I grew up. I don't have to, I can no longer objectify people in the same way because I've had this. That's where I think that comes into play. And so I don't think you can have a conversation with someone that would have any sort of tangible results unless it was couched in that compassionate worldview. I mean, for example, if it comes just from a you're wrong and this is why, or
right.
it's not right to treat people this way. They're not going to understand that,
It's too
because
abstract.
it's too abstract. Exactly. You have to take it into the experience as opposed to whatever your words were before, the gnosis and the, you have
Noesis,
you have to make the chai tea with them. And so that
Yeah.
they know that it's, we're all the same. 99.9%. We're all the same.
Yeah. Interesting thing, they note that homophobia is more rampant among people who don't have any gay friends they know about. The more people actually know that they have gay friends, the harder it is for them to be homophobic. Because they're like, it's one thing to be afraid of the gays. It's something else to be afraid of Bob, my friend. It's like who I had pizza with last night. Not all that scary. Actually, kind of a nice guy. It's like the tangible experience of the world erodes away the abstractions of noesis and makes it possible to replace them with actual concrete gnostic knowledge. It's kind of the power of reality if we can let it in, if we can find opportunities. So it's part of why, for example, I grew up in Seattle. They had mandatory school busing. People had to bus from all over the city to mix people up so that they met each other. And the experience that we had in Seattle is that race-based violence got a whole lot better for a long time until we stopped it, because everybody knew people, right? People weren't abstractions anymore. You wouldn't just like have somebody that you read about in a book or some newscaster was telling you about troublemakers. It was all these people that you knew personally. It's like, well, why would I be afraid of Black people? And if it weren't for Black people, I would be I would be bereft in my personal life. All these people who I love and care about would be gone. It's like it's a totally different question for people when it becomes tangible and personal than when it's an abstraction. But this goes back to Hegel. Abstract reasoning is a real menace.
I was just about to bring that up. I mean, that is so profound. To abstract is to be in error. That quote that you put earlier in the chat, that's incredible.
Can I just say, though, that while I hear about compassion, one of the things that the Europeans did when they colonized the other continents, not only was it a physical experience, it was also an emotional experience. Yes. And that emotional experience is what created the other. Yes. That still exists today. Yes. Right? And so the compassion should not come from the individual, but the compassion has got to be a cultural experience. Like riding on the school bus with people from other races, Black, Orientals, Native Americans. Yes. That lived experience creates the compassion for you. And when you grow up, you take that into the creation of a new culture.
I'm sorry, yes, go ahead, Sharon. Finish your sentence.
So compassion is an entity, is a starting place, but not at the individual level. It's in my point of view, it's a cultural level. And I don't know how to express that in philosophical terms.
I think that's exactly what Ken Smith is trying to say here, is that we are just all a product of the culture that we grow up in. And that's why the baby grows, you can't really do too much to the child as opposed to with it. And so, yeah, I think we should be celebrating acts of cooperation in everywhere we can. You shouldn't be able to open a newspaper or turn the internet on without seeing because they're really objectively, there's billions of acts of cooperation occurring all around us every second of every day. It's only the competition, the competitive aspects that they're so rare, but they get all the press, right? If it bleeds, it leads. It's this focus on what goes wrong instead of what goes right. I always used to say, I would have a comedy program, a news station, and a reporter standing on the corner saying, and this woman crossed the corner and absolutely nothing happened. And she was able to cross safely. And actually someone helped her across the street and the driver didn't have to stop, but he did slow down. But you don't hear about any of this. Yes. And that's where I think what you say is so true, Sharon. It has to be a cultural value that we all celebrate together.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great point.
Yeah, it's good stuff. I mean, I think that you can tell from the way he goes after corruption and the Bush dynasty and all of the worst parts of modernism that Kenneth Smith's philosophy is very amenable to dealing with issues of social justice. He doesn't take it as far as it can go, but he sets up the stage for other people to pick it up and run with it, as it were. The same philosophical framework about what goes through the mind of a racist person while they're generalizing about another group, instead of saying, well, it's all about hate, or it's all about the passion, the ways that we think about it. He can point out the way how much of it is just about abstract reasoning. It's because someone doesn't have enough tangible information, and they filled it in with stuff they've made up, or that somebody's made up for them to take the place of the tangible experience of life. And it offers strategies, like you're saying, about, well, then how do we defeat this? What do we do to overcome racism and to make a better world? It sort of sets the stage, but I think it's got to be participatory. And that's another thing that I like about Kenneth Smith's philosophy, is that
participatory. Yes.
Yeah, he's not asking us to just go around and tell everybody what he said. He's like, no, take these tools and take it further and apply it to questions of Black reparations for slavery. Apply it to questions of what do we owe Indigenous people, and how do we change our systemic relationships with each other in order to create more justice? And how do we change all of the how do we understand patriarchy in a way that doesn't just result in another, okay, we're just going to fight for another 150 years and not get anywhere? Or is there some way that we can actually pick this thing apart, see what makes it tick, and actually begin to replace it with something better?
Yeah.
I welcome the opportunity to bring this additional philosophical depth into the struggle for social justice. There's ways in which, when we are struggling for social justice, so many things just make us so angry. Me personally, I'm angry a lot of the time, and I find my thinking isn't as good then. It's as Patrick's pointed out a couple times in this call, I will reflexively scapegoat because it's so easy to do, but it doesn't get me anywhere. It is important to know who's doing what and to understand, where problems are coming from. But then to get past that point, we have to, like Einstein said, think about things on another level that isn't the same level that got us into the trouble in the first place.
I've got a thought on how do we create social justice in our relationships with each other. Marcus Garvey had this thing, another thing you didn't learn about in history, Black capitalism, right?
Yeah.
And there were like amazing, like it wasn't like Tulsa, it was like the Black Beverly Hills, and so there's this tradition of using ideology to create beneficial economic relationships.
Yeah.
And I think that could really be revived, especially with the internet. You could find out, I could get a discount from this merchant because, I'm a CPR certified person, or, this guy will give discounts if you can answer this quiz about Kenneth Smith, maybe, or like, and you could have all these customized kind of coupons. I call them like letter Q, PON, like quality coupon. So I'm actually trying to launch this coupon.info thing where it'd be all these customized, justice economic relationships, that could be totally, it's kind of like, you got boycott and procot, where you refuse to do business with someone and you're going to preferentially totally patronize someone. Well, there's a whole middle range of economic, ideological relationships that could be explored between those two poles. So that's just my little thing I'm trying to develop right now. Take you to entrepreneurship class.
Cool.
Henry George School, and supposed to come up with an elevator pitch tomorrow night. So
good luck.
Hope I do it on that.
Good luck.
Hi, Sharon. I saw you had your hand up.
I like the concept where you think that social justice should be participatory. My only issue with that is I look out in the environment at the intellectual level, or the ability to understand of and I'm going to say electorate, and it is, for me, I view it as problematic, because the ability to think critically and make choices, different choices, informed choices, is not that great.
Yeah.
So that's an additional hurdle. And you were talking about what your education exposes you to, And that, I think, is a fundamental problem.
It is. I'm with you completely. And this, speaking of the ways in which this essay goes places, to think that
Yes.
this thing is driven by a couple of poems, right?
Yes.
That's what makes this thing go. And after he quotes the second poem at the bottom of page 9, he gets into that question of the throb of the artery, the response to the horror of war, and that pulse of life.
Yes.
And in page 10, near the bottom, he says something that has stuck with me since David first pitched this, and I read it and went, oh God. And I'm going to read it now. Not that we need more, oh dear God, but oh dear God, here's a couple of sentences. No such thing as enlightenment will ever come to the perversely select true believers who made this crypto revolution possible. The legacy of the modern era is an inconceivable mass benightedness, a darkening of minds such that they are ruined forever, as if they had been mortally addicted to drugs whose grip could never be broken. They have been forever blinded to political and social reality by experts. They're walking refutations of the naive modern faith in universal educability. And he's talking about the way that an anti-culture can warp the developing mind of an infant and a child to such a point that it becomes a self-enclosing envelope, a labyrinth, so that there's no line of reasoning that leads out of the delusions. They all lead back into it, back to the center. Everything has been bent back upon itself. And that no matter how you try to reason with somebody who's in the grip of a delusion like that, it doesn't get you out of it. It just circles back around. And that's a challenge for people who live their lives through reasoning and communication, because the assumption is that the solution to the world's problems is more reasoning and communication. But in cases like this, the only thing that could possibly reach people who've been tied into such a knot mentally is life experience, new
Yes.
life experiences that contradict the labyrinth that they're stuck in. And so I think about Jackie Robinson, whose story I just adore, and all that he had to put up with to do what he did. But that the reason for persisting was that so many bigots couldn't imagine that a Black person could be a great baseball player. They loved baseball playing. They hated Black people, and they couldn't put the two together in their head. And there was no argument you could possibly have given them that would have convinced them it was possible. But actually experiencing Jackie Robinson performing play after play after play, doing those things that they were sure were impossible, broke their labyrinth for them. And some of them went to their grave hating Black people no matter what and insisting that it didn't change. But a large number of people who were bigots couldn't stay completely trapped in their labyrinth. The labyrinth fractured, and they had to admit that they'd been at least a little bit wrong, because Jackie was amazing. His baseball plays were incredible. I mean, all of the old arguments just sort of fell on their faces in the actual lived experience of this guy doing these things. And it reminds me of the story about Nichelle Nichols on Star Trek and Uhura and Martin Luther King Jr. You all know the story about the conversation between MLK and Uhura and Nichelle Nichols.
No.
So the writers weren't giving her great lines, and they weren't letting her be a really active character. She was in the background. And she got to say things like hailing frequencies open, and she was so frustrated. Yeah, you could rewatch first season of the original Star Trek, and you will see that she is acting her heart out. Every gesture, every body language, every expression, she's trying to make up for all the lines she doesn't have by inhabiting the role so completely. She's my favorite character on The Bridge for that reason. She just does some amazing things. At the end of first season, she had a conversation with Martin Luther King Jr. where she said, I got to leave the show because they just are not writing anything for this character. I feel like I'm wasting my time. And he said, please don't. He said, the most important thing what you're doing is revolutionary. He said, the most important thing that you can do is just to be a Black officer on the premier starship of the future, on the bridge in a command position. It's great when you get a line. It's great when you get an opportunity to, do some body language or expressions or act out a role, but none of that is as important as the fact that you're there, because it destroys all these labyrinths in which people have a vision of the future that doesn't include any Black people. right? Or in which black people stay at home and are servants to the real protagonists who go out and are the actors, right? The racist insistence that to be black is to be in an existence of pathos and pathein, and that you need some master who's the actor and decider who does things, and your job is to support him, right? That's the traditional racist American role. But here she is on the bridge of the Enterprise. She's a command officer. She doesn't, it's great when she says something, but she just being there, like Jackie Robinson, just playing the game is enough to just shatter a lot of preconceptions. And it does it more persuasively than anything we could have said to those people. So I don't know how many of you guys like funk music. I grew up in South Seattle in the 70s, and I've got funk running through my brain and my veins all the time. But one of the things that I love about funk is the Funkadelic Parliament consortium of groups. They just spun off group after group after group. And they were so playful. They were so absurd. The covers were ridiculous, cartoons and all kinds of stuff. But the thing that they did, which riffed right off of Nichelle Nichols on the bridge of the Enterprise, was black people in space. Over and over and over, cover after cover shows, the Funkadelic connection. Here's a black man in a futuristic suit on a UFO flying through the stars. And the whole message of Funkadelic Parliament is, yeah, right, baby. The future is black. We are going to be out there in space. We're high tech. We're advanced. And all of your primitivist, stereotypes about us, we laugh at that, right? We're you go on saying your racist things, and we're going to fly through the stars. It's right here on the cover.
I've got kind of an Uhura story. I did public affairs radio at UC Irvine's college station in the 90s. And I had this show, Radio Free Hemp, and I had it for like 7 years. This was, it was a regular weekly show. And one day I got this call from, a fan. He's like, hey, you want to go out for a burger and a beer? And, it turns out this guy is like, millionaire, owns a landscape supply company. And I was kind of like going, oh, I'm sorry, the show's not that good. I'm just like reading, press releases from Normal. And he's like, no, just the fact that you're on the program guide with the show called Radio Free Hemp, you could play dead air, and you're doing like great work. And, sure enough, by the time the show went off the air, Prop 215 had passed,
right,
in California, and I got to interview all the people in the hemp movement. It was like really, really a great 7 years. I mean, it's like best time of my life. College radio, can't beat it.
That's so cool.
That was kind of like an Uhura, Martin Luther King, Nichelle Nichols.
I think that perfectly elucidates the concept that Kenneth Smith is trying to get at here, is that you created culture that was a part of your value system, and that's why it was able to have such tremendously positive impact.
Yeah.
And I just think that's just so wonderful that we come around to that. And, it's exactly what he's saying here in this essay. And just, you cannot get away from values. And it's just such a powerful concept.
So compassion has got to be a value, which has got to be cultural.
Yeah.
Right. We
have to celebrate it culturally so that it can be inborn into us and that we can't deviate from it. It has to be so. We almost have to brainwash ourselves to be compassionate, I think, through our culture. And that's maybe what ancients did through their plays and literature and, the oral traditions that they passed down. Except now we've commodified our culture to such an extent that it's just whatever makes money. There's no tie-in to a value system, or it's very thin.
You have to move the culture somewhere else outside of the established structures, which is what a lot of these, cultural movements have always done throughout time, is wherever there's blockage, you find a way to flow around it and make a great flowering somewhere else that everybody now wants to come join that. I think about how in America today, the stereotypical jazz fan is an old white guy with a collection of records, right? But in the 1920s through 40s, jazz fans were rebels. They're like, oh my God, you're listening to black music, black and white people mingling. Oh my God. It was this horrific revolutionary thing that the racists were just like, their heads were exploding, that white people would enjoy that music, it's with the rhythms and oh God, it's so primitive. It's getting under my skin and changing me. You get this sense of corruption and contamination in my precious bodily fluids and purity. You could feel all of that panic coming from jazz early on, but jazz was great, right? It drew people in, even some people who were only moderate racists, but thought that they were big racists, ended up just loving jazz and loving black musicians and giving up on the racist part because
And
they're like,
copied it.
I care more about jazz than I care about my stupid bigotry. So fine, I let the one go so that I can have the other, right?
Say,
you know that Harry Anslinger released a memo one time, is like, we're going to round up all the jazz musicians in the country on this date, like this was like, because jazz musicians are the source of all this hemp badness, and they're, and the agents just like said, forget this is crazy, Anslinger, we're not going to do this.
It was very similar with early rap too. That music was so positive and all about cultural change and, shining a light on areas that hadn't ever been talked about before, and really community oriented. And then all of a sudden it was objectified into, whatever sold the most. Let's show, women in skimpy bikinis and flashing money, and it just totally lost but it started from such a positive place.
The race to the bottom of commercialization affects every part of culture that it can get a hold of.
That movie Wild Style is a great documentary about the birth of hip hop culture. If you ever get a chance to see that.
Cool. I'll check that out. Wild Style.
People with, just inventing scratching in the streets of New York, and the artists and the breakdancers, oh man, that was before it became about, bitches and money hip hop, right?
It was so wholesome. I mean, it was just...
Yeah, right. It's like family values hip hop.
It really was. Yeah.
I would say, as a defender of rap music, I love the quote from Chris Rock where he says, "I love rap music, but I hate defending it." The good stuff is still there. It's just really underground. And as you said, money is just like pervading into every area of life, and it's just destroying a lot of music and all you see on or hear on the radio. But like the good stuff is still there, so it'll resurface soon.
And we played a ton of hip hop on KUCI, and that was like a total volunteer thing, by the way. And people would make fun of KUCI. Oh, you guys are only 200 watts, but that 200 watts reached about 10-mile radius from UC Irvine, and that made us like the 6th biggest demographic, station. Like 1 million people in the listening area, right? So cool.
Yeah, I keep thinking about Gandhi saying, be the change you want to see in the world. And, to what extent can we win things through arguments? And to what extent do we win things by modeling a better world and having people look at it and go, I think I'd rather do what they're doing than what I'm doing, because that looks like more fun and more humane. And I feel better about myself when I do that.
You really can't get people to do stuff unless it's fun too. Like they say about making an exercise program. Well, if it's not fun, they're not going to stick with it. So.
Well, fun or profound as well. I mean, you can also feed that hole in our soul that can't be fed by the market. You can deal with pain. I think about some of the contemporary hip hop. Dowdy talks about contemporary hip hop. That's good stuff. And I think about some of the ones about the prison, the school to prison pipeline, and about racist violence by police officers against the Black community. There's some really politically smart rap out there right now. It's just being drowned out by the noise. But if we can, direct our attention to the parts that are meaningful, and even if it's not fun, even if it hurts, because it's talking about uncomfortable things, we feel more healed by confronting the things that have been gnawing at us, but that we haven't looked at. It's like finally,
like come for the fun, stay for the healing. Could be a
right. Come for the fun, stay for the healing.
So I sort of see that as like one of the biggest, sort of going back to what we were discussing earlier about like being able to look at your culture and in observing and not abstracting and try to change it. I think one of the biggest issues is the pain that you do feel when you start to realize that you have been sort of creating this illusion or creating this spectacle. And it reminds me of Plato's cave, and I always say the allegory, and I always say in my opinion, the most important part is the fact that he's in so much pain as he breaks out of the cave, and the reason they don't want to escape is because of the pain. It's like I would think as individuals, as humans, we are wanting the truth, so to speak, or like we want what's good, we want what's fulfilling, we want what, etc., but we're just afraid of the pain that comes with it, right?
Yeah.
So if we could just like get over that pain, then we'd accept it we'd accept it readily. So yeah, it's very difficult in a sense to try to convince and not even just to convince people, but to like allow people to know that it's okay to suffer in order to get to like what you're really looking for, what you're really striving for, as opposed to like, oh, I'm comfortable now and that light looks really painful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe even that suffering is necessary to get
Yeah.
to where you're going. That without suffering, it's almost impossible to learn anything about life.
That's the, the Agamemnon by Aeschylus, the tragedian, just haunts all of these philosophical discussions. Drop by drop, wisdom is distilled from pain. It's like we are satisfied with our delusions until we reach a point where some part of the world that we insist on experience and acknowledging can't be reconciled with who we are right now. And then we go through this horrible growing pain where we become somebody new. And then our ego has to catch up afterwards and figure out, well, now who am I?
It's a perfect metaphor for what we're dealing with climate change, right? We had to sort of destroy the world until we all realized how important it is and that it's actually worth saving.
Yeah.
And now we're having that difficult period, that transition of finding a new ego. What are we going to look like in this new world? What is it going to be? It's exactly what you were saying, Rick. I have to leave. This was wonderful, and I'm really looking forward to the next one. Thank you, everyone. This was great, and thanks for bringing Ken Smith to this. This is great that what you guys are doing. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, glad to hear it. We'll see you next Monday.
Okay, see ya.
Yeah. This is it's a potent. It's a short little essay, and it's not perfect. It's not fully worked out, and it's not fully systematized, and he doesn't always hit the notes quite right. If we come back to this next week, depending on who's here, I might haul out some of my critiques of it. But what's great is that it's so evocative. He brings up things that really, really matter, and frequently underscores them well, so that we get that there's something potent at work here. It's like I think some of the stuff on gender is right on the money, and some of the stuff on gender misses the mark, but it brings up the subject of gender, and it does it profoundly. And I particularly like the way that he brings up the issue of the vulnerability of the infant and our attachment to it and our wanting the best for it and wanting to give it the best. And it makes us confront to what extent are we actors in the world who can shape the world to make a better world for them, and to what extent are we sufferers who suffer the world as it is and can't give the child what it needs and what we wish for it. That's about lowered expectations, I think, is there it is. Here it is. It is only, this is the last paragraph, it is only for their earliest years that we can at all protect our children from the world and from the ways of the world. We hardly think to protect them at all with the requisite prophylactic wisdom. Ultimately, we realize that we cannot make a world fit for the outsized hopes we have for our children. Talk about diminished expectations. But we can try to make our children tough enough to resist the delusions by which the world manipulates its vast populations. And then this is the part that it just sang for me, this next phrase. And we can try to make them exemplary enough humans that others can use them like the 36 Lachmed Vovniki of Judaism as moral tuning forks, the intuitive souls without which the world would have no notion what justice is supposed to be. It's like, even if we can't fix the world, if we can try to help these people develop into their best selves so that other people, when they experience them, say, I'd rather be doing that. I want to be more like that person. I want to change the world however much I can by being that way. Like all the people who are drawn to jazz, all the people drawn to baseball or Star Trek or to funk music or to whatever it is that broke them out of their shells and made them say, other things are possible that are better, that let me be a better person. I like the idea of people living or trying to live as exemplars, to try to do the right thing so that other people can see that it's possible to try to do the right thing. It's like, in some ways, I can't remember who first said it. I was reading somewhere about the futility of rational argument when you're trying to confront somebody about their deepest values, and that they won't change those values for you no matter what line of argument you give them, but their lived experience can. their lived experience can change it. And so in some ways, it's more important to try to be a good person and to behave well and to develop a cool culture so that other people can experience it and let that work against their mentality than it is to come up with the perfect line of argument or elevator pitch for why it's better to be a good person.
Yeah, there was a Dick Gregory interview where he was talking about the futility of trying to like impose freedom, American freedom on other people. And he's like, ain't no one gonna take nothing that ain't nailed down. They'll come here and steal it if it's really good, It's like, and that's true of like, you can't impose any belief on someone. They have to, want it for themselves by seeing how great it looks to them, And then I'm like parenting though, I thought the consensus was like, it's a crapshoot. Like you can be a great parent and have awful kids, and you can be an awful parent and have great kids. Like there's very little correlation between good parenting and good outcomes. I don't know if that's true or not, but I just talked to a lot of parents that seem to think that was the case.
So there's this complicated dynamic between who the person essentially is born as and what the culture is that they grow into. So there's this Greek notion they come back to over and over that we're seeds of the future. We're seeds of our future selves, that we're always in a process that they call aliosis, which is a verb that means to othering, becoming other, mutatis mutandis, mutating all the time, and that we're not mutating randomly, that we're like the acorn that decision by decision, growth by growth, day by day is throwing up new shoots and new leaves. And because of where it's planted, maybe on one side is a tree that casts shade, and so it doesn't grow as much in that direction, and the other direction is sunlight, and it grows more that way than it would have. And so the teleology of who the infant was going to become is shaped by the culture that they grow into. If the culture is really wholesome, and if it really encourages self-scrutiny, then they could develop the ability to observe their own character and become participants in shaping themselves. But if they're born into an anti-culture that encourages them never to look inside and to always be distracted by entertainments and advertisements and consumption, then it's luck of the draw what they're born with, because they can't shape themselves after that. It's like this ability. It's like the teleology of a living thing has complex potential rather than simple linear potential, and we don't know which of the many things that it could grow into it's going to become. And that's where the role of culturing comes in, is to give it the opportunities.
I think our minds are kind of acclimatized to looking for the simplest cause and effect correlations, and it's rarely has a one-to-one correspondence like that.
Yes. I mention it regularly, but I'm going to mention it again. Christopher Alexander's book, The Phenomenon of Life, where he talks about the importance of an architecture that doesn't stamp out buildings like little Xeroxes, but that instead every building, you first look at what's around it. Because one building might to the left have a little pond where ducks might land in the summer. You might want to put a window facing that way. But then the next house next to it can't see the pond, and you wouldn't want to put the window there. But if you put the window on the other side, there's a view of the mountain. And so each house ought to be fitted to its specific circumstances. It ought to be adapted. And because that's what living things do. Why does this tree grow to the left and that tree grows to the right? Because they were in each other's way. And that way they maximize the sunlight they could reach. And
that's
why?
Like, Christopher Alexander's pattern language kind of.
Yes. Yeah. He in the pattern language, it's that level of understanding is implicit. The patterns give you a way to do that, but he doesn't talk about it directly. He talks about it some in the timeless way of building, but in the timeless way of building, he's more trying to contrast traditional adaptive architecture with modern mass-produced architecture to show that they're different from each other. It's really not until The Phenomenon of Life that he really just straight up addresses what is living structure, what are living processes that create structure, what's the difference between imposing a fixed idea on the world in a noetic way and adapting iteratively to the world in a gnosic experiential way, and how all living things actually do the gnosic and not the noetic. There is no blueprint for the oak tree anywhere inside the acorn, just a series of a tendency to adapt over and over and over. that leads to what looks like an oak.
So Phenomenon of Life, you'd consider one of his more essential.
Yeah, it's book one of a 4-volume series called The Nature of Order. The second one is The Process of Creating Life, and that's where he examines living processes and how they generate living order. I think they're just outstanding. They're big, they're heavy, they're full of color and black and white photos. They're just lavishly illustrated, full of drawings and diagrams as he tries to describe these ideas that we experience every day of our lives, but that we don't have a lot of language for. We don't really understand what it is that we feel when we go out into the forest or look at a mountain. Why does it pull on us the way it does? Why do we feel differently when we walk the streets of Venice and look at these old buildings along these canals than we do when we walk into a housing development that was just stamped out last year? Why do we feel different? Why do we feel more alive with the one kind of architecture than the other? What is it doing to us, and how was it created? That's the stuff he really gets into.
And he's huge in permaculture, but he's not often acknowledged in permaculture circles too. But
yeah, and that's that. Go ahead.
That relates back to everything Kenneth Smith is talking about.
It does, right? I mean, gnosis and noesis is all over Christopher Alexander. Just this thing. The Hegel's there, the Kierkegaard's there, the Nietzsche's there, the Kafka's there. It's. There's a saying Kenneth Smith has that he does from time to time, which is there's only two kinds of philosophy. There's escapist and there's existential. And existential deals with, actual living structure in the living world and what do we need? And escapist is, don't worry about reality. Let me give you the system. Just think in terms of this system.
Yeah.
And it'll think for you, and don't worry your little mind about whether or not it fits the world.
The bond stand. Is that what was the other category besides Begriff?
Verstand.
Oh, Verstand. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. I thought the beginning of the chat got hacked off, but I see it's back.
It's up there. It's up there.
Go ahead.
What's so astonishing is that, the difference between gnosis and noesis, between Begriff and Verstand, is so decisive. Once we actually wrestle our way through Hegel and Kierkegaard and Smith and start to see the shape of them and their behavior and how they operate in us and how they change our reactions to the world, we can see what a huge impact they make. How much noesis was in the Nazi program for Germany. It was so noetic. It was so planned. You can actually explain for the first time why would the most scientifically and technologically advanced country in the world do a Holocaust. Right? Well, all the conventional attempts to explain it say, well, maybe they were scientifically advanced, but they were superstitious, or but they were prejudiced, or but Hitler was crazy, or they always have to somehow explain it as being an exception to the rational thought. And this is the first time I really see someone say it's because of the rational thought that they could do a Holocaust, because reason disengaged from concrete reality breeds horrors, right? As we impose our abstract programs upon the world. It's kind
of like you're book smart, but you're not street smart. It's kind of like that distinction a little bit, that you have all these degrees, but you don't have any on-the-job experience, so we're not interested in you.
Well, you think how many people who are afraid of gay people, they're afraid of their caricature, their cartoon of gay people that's in their heads, because they don't actually know any gay people. So what they have is noesis. They have this script, this little cartoon version, and it scares them. And they blame gay people for that fear that they feel, even though it's not actually them. It's like there's a diremption that happens in the mind where we focus on our sleepwalking version of reality and react to the real reality as though it's that sleep. This goes right back to Heraclitus, who accuses us all of not actually being conscious.
Well, or the Trumpers. There's 70 million people who think all Democrats are socialists from the pits of hell, And I mean, John Voight even had this is a choice between demons or Americanism, This is like, got this concept that Fox News is just stoking the fires of, and like.
I saw this woman on Facebook last week actually say government equals communism. If there's any government at all, it's communism. And we can only trust corporations and the ultra rich, right? Because they're not beholden to government and they would never hurt us. So they're free. She really believed it. Like she had built this version of the world in which, communism equals government. So I guess all governments in the history of the world have been communist by definition, right?
Well, it's like taxation is theft. These libertarians, taxation is theft. All taxes are the same as some guy stealing stuff from you.
Right, but if I do an SNL scandal and screw you out of your life savings, that wasn't a tax, so I didn't steal anything. Yay! Yeah. I must be full of virtue. So it's like once you get your head disengaged from reality and engage with these little systems of thought, you can conclude anything.
That's how Holocausts happen.
Anything becomes possible. You're no longer bound by or constrained by the tangible reality. I think about the way med students have to be chaperoned in hospitals. Someone's graduated from medical school. We think, great, they're a doctor now, but the hospital's like, oh no, they're not. Everywhere they go, they're going to be actual doctors watching them going, don't even think about it. I know you think you know because you have all this noesis in your head, but you have no tangible experience. So, you could land spoils and put in IVs and anything other than that, you better have a nurse watching you because she knows what she's doing and you do not know what you're doing. We see that with programming, writing medical software. The people who've been writing software for decades, so many great ideas that we learned in computer science departments that we just had to give up on once we actually got out into the world and discovered the theory is the land of theory is a very pretty place and everything adds up and makes sense. And then you sit down and try to write code that way and you crash the computer. It's like, turns out actually it's a terrible idea. It would be good in a theoretical world with theoretical computers that behave the way they're supposed to. But
I saw this list of 100 languages and where they rank in terms of CPU time and energy resources, and C was still number one. All the other languages were still, these guys, these are going to use more energy and more CPU time, and
yeah. So it's part of why I like. I don't know how many of you guys know about the channel NHK?
Yeah, the Japanese news channel.
Japanese news channel. Oh, Dowdy, if you ever get the opportunity to see NHK, it is like nothing you see in U.S. television. They have 10-minute or 20-minute or 30-minute programs that are about things like how do people make tires? Or here's a guy with a sushi restaurant who's been there for 40 years. Let's interview him and find out how he makes sushi. Or this is a gardener and they've been working in the same Japanese garden for 60 years. Let's go find out what their life is like and what it means to be a Japanese gardener. It's like reality. There's this constant immersion in experts who are magnificent at their job and have been doing it forever. And they tell you these things like, yeah, when I started, I had all these ideas about what I should do, and they all turned out to be bad ideas. But the garden taught me what it needed. I once, when I made my mistakes, I would discover, oh, the garden doesn't want that. The garden wants this instead. And you sort of hear the process by which they graduate out of their noesis and back into the gnosis that they were born with as infants. It's like if you can be live with reality, if you can suffer the pain of being wrong, then reality will teach you what it wants. And what
I think
it wants
NHK is doing what CBC wanted to do, but didn't quite make it.
Yeah, I've never seen anything like it. This channel is a riot. It reminds you of the good old days back when they introduced television and thought it would become this medium for educating the world. And it's like, well, NHK really does, in fact, they really are actually teaching us things that, when would I ever have heard about this little old lady who runs the sushi shop in this one neighborhood of Tokyo? I would never have learned about that, right? It's like, but there she is, and she's making the sushi the way that her grandma taught her, and it's like, oh, other people do it this way. It's faster, and but here, try this one that I made. And the person eats the sushi rolls like, oh my God, that's the best sushi I've ever had. Yeah, I know, it's a little slower, but it makes such a difference when you do this little thing here that I do.
College public affairs shows are kind of like that sometimes too. You get all these weird people coming in volunteering and to do radio on these weird little subjects, that like you can, and most of them are streamed on the internet too, so you can shop around and find some.
I should look for that.
There's a program called film school on KUCI, which the guy's been doing it for like 20 years now. That's really a good. It's kind of like NHK. It's kind of weird little offbeat topics.
Yeah, so there's a part of me that kind of really wants to, in addition to kind of publishing Kenneth's stuff and doing these seminars with David and all of y'all, there's a part of me that I want to build on it and work with people in the social justice community to kind of add another layer to it, to sort of extend it into the, Kenneth can write all day long and he can still only get to a certain number of issues. Mm-hmm. It's like, we need more people to be saying, what is the impact of this proposition in California, and what would Hegel have to say about that, and how does this debate, in this legislature reflect, noesis versus gnosis, and you can pick the argument instead of saying Republicans and Democrats and all these kind of useless categories that aren't actually making the deep-rooted distinctions about why things happen the way they do. We could actually cut to the chase and say, well, which are the states that have adopted, about the gay panic defense? Yeah,
like Dan White shooting, or Harvey Milk shooting Dan White, Dan White shot Harvey Milk. Because
in a certain number of states.
Defense, but yeah, I think there was some gay panic mixed in there.
You could defend yourself against murder if you murdered a gay person by saying you experienced panic, that it was scary because it was a gay person. That's the majority of states in America.
It's kind of like heat of passion murders. Like,
it's what?
I got my wife in bed with someone.
38 states. In 38 states in America, you literally can get off from murder by saying, well, he was gay and I had a panic. So there's a very, like most Americans have no idea, first of all, that that's the law, right?
That's better than stand your ground, right?
I mean, it's wild. I feared for my life. I thought he was going to pervert me, right? So the number of states that have actually outlawed gay panic as a defense is just disturbingly small. And then there's a middle group of states that are starting to erode the gay panic defense, but haven't got there yet. And you can find maps of this on the internet if you look for it.
Is it literally, I felt myself at risk of being turned into a gay person, so I had to shoot him, Or...
Well, it's understandable that I would panic in the presence of a gay person. They're scary.
Because they might suck you in, right?
I mean, anything might happen, right? I might start dressing better. I don't know. You wonder what exactly.
There's some UFOs with aliens. Call the army and shoot at them.
I wonder sometimes if it doesn't come down to I've always suspected that I was gay and I'm afraid of it, and I don't want to deal with gay people because then I might have to come out of the closet. It's like what is actually at work it's hard to know. But whatever it is, the astonishing thing is that that's our actual state of law in this country, and that most Americans don't know that that's the world we're living in, right?
Or the Texas dildo laws, right? That's.
Oh no, I don't know this. You're about to frighten me.
Oh, it's some ludicrous law, like you're allowed to have 3 dildos, but it's real. I have to look it up. It's
a certain number, but not any more than that, because if you have more than that, then you're dangerous.
It's like any more than this way, this number or this kind is illegal, and because
oh my God,
obviously gonna.
So I think about what passes for politics in America and the way we go at each other, like. We don't talk about people's actual positions. We attack them for being a member of the category that they self-identify as. Oh, you're a Democrat. That means, and then out comes the noetic list of all the evils of Democrats. Oh, you're a Republican. Out comes all the noetic list of all the things that Republicans are, whether they are or not, whether that's their position or not, and they do it to both sides, right? If I'm a Democrat, hypothetically speaking, and I want to attack a Republican, I'm going to attack him not for what he believes, but for what I think Republicans are. And I'm also going to defend the Democrats, not on the basis of what they are, but for what I think they are. Again, in my mind, I have an imaginary Democrat and I have an imaginary Republican, and I'm pitting them against each other. And I'm using the two actual human beings as punching bags, as they're sort of my puppets for working out this noetic battle in my head. But you think, how unproductive is that? Well, what does that actually do to make the world a better place? Whereas we could just make a list of all the states that still have a stupid gay panic defense and put together some propositions to get those laws overturned so that, fewer gay people die in America. We could actually literally make a difference if we focused on the tangible, concrete issues of our lived reality instead of being lost always at this noetic level that is really divorced from the reality of politics in America. Or how many states have gerrymandered districts, right? Where it doesn't matter who the majority is because they're going to be outvoted by a minority who has gerrymandered the districts to put themselves in charge. That should be banned everywhere. All districts should be made by some rational process that results in, a fair representation of the people who are there. And it's not like we don't know how to do that, but we would have to stop arguing about imaginary Democrats and imaginary Republicans and instead make a list of the states that have the most gerrymandered things and focus on doing that. And if we did that, those states would suddenly change politically. The way that they were represented in the national government would change. The policies of those states would change. Who got elected in those states would change by focusing on the concrete, tangible reality instead of the imaginary sock puppets, that we have fighting each other.
Yeah, there's a great documentary that just came out that goes through the playbook of voter suppression, and there's like 8 things, and I was like, okay, check that. We got the judges. Check that. We changed the thing. Check this. We like disenfranchised people. We made it really hard with ID. Okay, check that. It was like
close down all the registration places.
Yeah,
yes.
And Republicans have been doing this like methodically for like the past 20 years, and it's been working. They are it's like the textbook of voter suppression. I mean, they wrote it and they're following it, and we're seeing the effects.
So this is where, I feel like there's part of what Dowdy raised earlier about anger that we didn't address the way that we needed to. And that is, compassion is important and compassion is good. And it's great that we have compassion, but it is not sufficient. The Beatles were wrong. Love is not all you need. There are other virtues besides love, and you need them too. Now, America loves to glorify Martin Luther King Jr., who's one of my personal heroes, but they like to vilify Malcolm X, who's also one of my personal heroes. It's like there's times for compassion and there's times for anger. And one of the things that I learned in an abusive household is that if the household doesn't allow anger to be expressed, if it insists that anger is evil and bad and corrupting and nobody's ever allowed to be angry, then it means nobody's ever allowed to confront the abuser, because there's no polite way to say, please stop hitting me. There isn't a polite way to say, because to do that, you're having to admit the truth that they don't want you to ever say, which is that, sometimes you lose your temper and you hit me, and you should never do that because that's morally reprehensible. So there's this level at which, attending to the tangible reality, the concrete reality that we face, allows us to escape abstract questions like, is love all you need? And to deal with kind of the more coherent steps that we can take to make a better world, which is like, yes, I love you, but you will not be allowed to hit me anymore. Yes, you're a human being and I wish the best for you, but you will not be allowed to gerrymander these districts anymore. So I don't care what your rationalization was for doing it. It's beyond the pale, and I'm going to stand against you. And, compassion tempered with anger and other virtues, I think, is a more powerful compassion than the compassion that merely forgives everything and always turns the other cheek.
Yeah, well, we need to retrieve that social component of compassion where we're actually listening to each other and not just waiting for them to stop talking so we can start,
Yeah. There's one of the many papers lying around somewhere from Kenneth Smith is an interesting, he set himself as a job when he was young, when he's a teenager. He said, well, I want to read all the hardest philosophers. I want to know which philosophers other people don't read because they think they're too hard, and I want to read those guys, and I want to understand what they said, which I sympathize with. That kind of how do I say it, contrarian, uppity, rebellious, I want to test myself thing. I totally get that, right? I sympathize with that. So he read Marx along with all the others, and he wrote a paper in which he tried to summarize Marx's core arguments, not according to Marxists, but according to Marx himself, so that he could highlight the difference between Marx and Marxists. This was the point of his paper. What did Marx actually, not what have we all been told Marx said, what did Marx actually say? And it was short, and they were like little numbered paragraphs, and they're like, I don't know, 35 of these little things, which each one was like, here's one of Marx's points that you're not going to hear very often. One of my favorite things out of that paper is the following. He says, Marxists always talk about the class struggle as though it's good guys versus bad guys. The bad guys are in charge and they run everything and they own everything and they're mistreating the good guys. And the good guys need to rise up and beat the bad guys because the bad guys are getting what they want, but the good guys are not getting what they want. And he says, well, Marx didn't say that at all. What Marx said is ownership and strategy and planning is only half of human work experience. Hands-on doing things and creating things in the world is the other half of human work experience. Laborers get to have the experience of building a house or a car, and that experience is nourishing for the human soul. We are like a kind of homo faber. We can't feel complete unless we are interacting with the world and making it better through our own efforts. Capitalists don't get to have that ever. They have half of a human existence, which they get to own things and decide who's allowed to do things, but they don't actually do anything themselves. And as a result, it is not a satisfying mode of life. It's empty and it itches and it drives them to do things that make things worse instead of making things better. The antidote that they need is the thing that they look down on and are avoiding, which is to roll up their sleeves and go fix a car or dig a garden or lay a line of pipe and get some water into a house. That the actual experience of life helps to make us whole. And so he says that the thing that characterizes capitalism can only partly be described as haves versus have-nots. It's also doers versus do-nots. And the do-nots are as oppressed in their way as the doers are. The reason to overthrow capitalism is not so that the capitalists are defeated and the workers can have what they want. It's so that all human beings can live a more fulfilled life, because capitalism turns us all into half people, just different flavors of half people.
There's actually people who make money by converting traditional capitalist enterprises into worker-owned enterprises. There's actually like a potential bottom line improvement when you do that. I mean, you look at like was it Mondrian? It's Mondragon. That's the it's like the 7th biggest industrial concern in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
It was started in Spain by a bunch of of Catholic priests and a bunch of broke.
I've heard about that.
Yeah, and now they're like in everything. And Green Bay Packers, fan-owned team. Harley Davidson, employee-owned company. I mean, would Marx be happy with that, state of affairs? Maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Fix capitalists by making everything worker-owned, right?
But what a human being wants is both to be the actor in their life doing things, but also to be allowed to decide which things they're going to do, and to have autonomy as a political entity, to not just be passive and to suffer.
Mm-hmm.
So co-ops and these kinds of things. That's definitely the kind of flavor that Marx was going for.
Yeah, and if human nature is such that people will just go gaga over something that they had a hand in creating, if they didn't have any hand in creating it, yeah, they're probably going to be kind of ambivalent about it. But boy, when you get some personal creative involvement, that's maybe he was also talking about a mental class warfare.
Yeah,
that goes on.
Yeah.
Our minds too.
Yeah, because he was a Hegelian. So this whole thing about Gnosis and Noesis, Verstand and Begriff, Marx read all that. He thought about all that. And he's portraying the class warfare under capitalism the same way that Hegel portrayed any other dialectic, that you've got a thesis and an antithesis, and the struggle between the two, when it's resolved, can produce a synthesis that gives us a new direction. This kind of triangle is everywhere in Marx, just like it is in Hegel. So I think
triangle of consciousness or something.
Yeah. So I think in this essay, Kenneth Smith is trying to do the same thing with gender, but I think, and it brings up a lot of great topics, which we're going to get into in the weeks ahead in the follow-up chapters. But I think there's untapped potential here. If we got LGBTQ people involved in this discussion, if we got feminists involved in this discussion, if we got some trans experts in this discussion, the understanding of where gender is at today is a lot further along than it was when Kenneth wrote this. Beverly and I were talking last night about how even 5 years ago, our understanding of gender and gender roles and sex was so different than it is today. There's been a huge amount of work in this area, in our culture and social justice. And there's a potential here to apply these Hegelian, Kierkegaardian, Smithian principles kind of more fully to a more rounded and developed concept of gender than the original binary that he was working with in here. So it's one of the things that I've actually been thinking about, depending on who we can get on next week, if we can get enough of the right kinds of representatives who can bring their perspectives to bear, we could actually work on writing a follow-up essay.
Can I get a link to the essay? I didn't read it, but
oh yeah, just go to the meetup page,
okay.
right? And it's linked to from right there. David put the link from there.
Okay.
Yeah. But I'll grab it actually. Let me go there right now. Meetup. Where'd it go?
Yeah, I know a male to female trans friend of mine that I've known since like the 80s.
Here it is. Copy.
A lot of them are just gender dysphoria people who really probably shouldn't have done full-blown conversion.
I have a surprising number of trans friends. It's interesting. But just the whole notion that biological gender and psychological gender can be different from each other, even from birth, that you can know in your gut that you're female even though you're in a male body, has been borne out by recent studies now, where they're actually comparing, the patterns, using CT scans and so forth to compare the brain patterns of different genders, and you can see that trans people, even before they undergo surgery or undergo hormonal therapy, their brain is already operating as the gender that they feel that they are, that they have always known that they are. So there's something powerful going on here.
I read kind of a far out theory just from one of these electric universe theorists that water is actually able to hold intention because of the way it's built, atomically, and so that would be kind of an interesting rabbit hole to go down. the whole consciousness intention aspect of water itself. Apparently there's something there. So,
we're coming up on the last 10 minutes, but let me dig a little just since you raised that. One of the premises of The Nature of Order, the last 4 books that Christopher Alexander did, is that we have misdefined life. By defining life as only being an organism, we create an artificial boundary in the universe between things that are absolutely alive and things that are absolutely not alive. And that creates a false problem of explaining, well, how could life come from lifelessness? Right? Life from lifelessness is even a phrase that's used in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, when they're talking about the Genesis device. And it's presented as a scientific miracle because even in a science fiction story, because we accept the absolute nature of these categories of alive and not alive, it presents a problem for us to explain the evolution of life. Abiogenesis is what they call the challenge. And Christopher Alexander's argument is that there is no absolute boundary between the two, and it's a fake problem. It's a noetic problem that we have generated by categorizing the universe the way that we have. And he says life isn't there is organismic life, and it is the conspicuous form of life, but that even things that aren't organisms are alive in a different sense, in a geometric sense, and in a sense of the process by which they are created. If the same processes of creation we associate with the generation of new cells or new organisms is being used to generate non-carbon-based things like sand dunes, right, or shorelines or mountains, then even though it doesn't have biological life, it has a kind of geometric life or geological life. And I'm not talking here about the force or any kind of, I'm not talking about woo. I'm talking about you could define the geometric characteristics of life as does it have a good shape? Is there interpenetration of boundaries? Is there a pattern that's being replicated outward, like the way we talk about fractals seeming like they simulate trees and feeling alive? The same way that you can see the slopes coming down off a mountain. The mountain doesn't have just one ridge, No mountain has just one ridge. Ridges and the replication of the pattern of ridges is intrinsic to what it means to be a mountain. Or on a beach, the waves of the sand dunes. So in the first volume, he says here's a list of 15 or 17 characteristics that are just simple geometric characteristics. And you can say, if some part of the universe has these geometric characteristics, then it has geometric life, even if it doesn't have biological life. Geometrically, it's alive. And he says, and one of the ways you know that is that when a human being who is alive is confronted with a piece of geometry that feels alive, that has geometric life, we respond to it. We have this powerful emotional reaction because life likes life. You know, they've done studies on people who spend all day looking at blank walls and computer screens in an office and what that does to you psychologically. You take that same person and you plop them outside and show them a tree, and you can measure the release of hormones and the psychological effect it has for them to finally see something alive again. Like, we're designed to seek out life. And part of the reason is, you know, animals that seek out dead deserts die, and animals that turn towards the food and the flowers live, right? It's natural that life would seek out life. It's a survival advantage, right? So Christopher Alexander's argument is the things that we see as living organisms also have geometric qualities that are measurable, and you can list them and check them off and say, well, yeah, a tree is alive not just because it's biologically alive, but you can look at the branching form. And you can look at the way that the leaves replicate, and you can look at the structure where it's got a trunk and that the branches diverge and then the twigs diverge and then the leaves diverge. There's patterns being replicated, and those are the same patterns in a good piece of architecture or a good piece of art that draws you into it.
Yeah,
but
that's why biodiversity is more alive than non-biodiversity.
Exactly. But then he says that's only one definition of non-biological life. There's a second definition of non-biological life you can use. And that is, how was it created? Right? Because we don't manufacture human beings or dogs. No matter how advanced we are, they have to grow. They have to emerge through a process of unfolding order. They start with sort of a, like the Greeks said, kind of a seed or an acorn or a nugget. And the nugget has some internal logic that it uses to unfold itself and express new order that is also at the same time an extension of the previous order. And now that it's at that state, the same thing happens. It has a slightly modified internal teleology, and it unfolds a new layer of order that reflects this new, more complicated internal structure. And it does this over and over, and that's the process by which a single fertilized egg becomes a human being. You know, we unfold limbs, we unfold a nervous system, like layer after layer of, we split, we diversify, we split, we diversify. So what he says is, when you look at geometry, whether it's a building or a piece of art or what have you, that has these characteristics of these living qualities, what you find is that nobody was ever able to make that ex nihilo. Nobody could just sit down and stamp out a piece of living structure. It can't be done. It can only be done by building it iteratively, stage after stage of unfolding a little more of the order and a little more of the order and a little more of the order, because that's how you get a strong center and a replication of patterns throughout the structure of the thing, is by responding to the order that already exists and the way it changed the space around it one more time and then one more time. And so what it means is, in the same way that there's a geometric life that's not biological life, but that all biological living things have, there's also a process of creating life. And that process of creating life is both used to create all biological life and also used to create all geometric life. They have it in common.
Wow.
This iterative, adaptive process of expressing the internal teleology. So whenever I read an essay like Daughters and Granddaughters, I'm seeing this all over it, where he talks about the naive, immersive experience of the infant and the way they discover things about themselves and about the world and change internally and adapt. Their behavior becomes more complex, their feelings and their thoughts become more complex, but it all builds off the original, whatever the original teleology was, changing it as it goes, you know, unfolding it as it goes, becoming more sophisticated.
So the reason we haven't had an ex nihilo life creation in a petri dish is because you can't put holographic fractals in a petri dish.
Right. It's like, you know, there are too many ways to go wrong if you just try to stamp it out of nothing. You know, there's too many ways in which what you would end up with was actually mechanical and not living structure at all. like all the houses that look the same way in a housing development. I had 3 models of houses. Every house in there is one of those 3. Stamp, stamp, stamp. And suddenly you've got a house whose window looks right into the bathroom window looks right into the bedroom window of the house next door, because they didn't pay any attention to what they were around, right? They're just stamped out mechanically.
Well, it's kind of ironic, you know, the transhumanist circles, people that want to upload their consciousness, they think, oh, well, we can obviously replicate just consciousness through, you know, some calculative, you know, model. But, you know, like Roger Penrose, he's like, no, there's this like self-aware quark, you know, orchestration going on of consciousness. But, oh, Roger Penrose, he's just on, you know, like crazy or something, you know, even though he's like a Nobel Prize winning, you know, physicist, you know, guy.
Yes.
It's funny. I just find that I'm kind of a pan psychicist. You know, I believe that the universe is probably built out of, you know, conscious quarks. Conscious. You know?
Well, so I guess the point which I lost track of, which I was going to say about the reason I spent all this time talking about Christopher Alexander and the idea of geometric life and process life instead of biological life, is that he would argue then that you could look at any non-living thing from a biological perspective, and you could tangibly measure how much geometric or process life it has. Right? The solar system evolved through adaptation over time, and it has a life. You can see it from a distance. The rings of the orbits of the planets nested within each other, the ways that comets interact with those orbits, the way that their shells, you know, the shock terminator boundary and so forth.
Or the way a lightning strike looks like the venation of a leaf, you know?
Yes. Yes, it's all got geometric order because geometric life, because it's followed the process, the living process by which it was developed. And so as a result, instead of having to say, well, these things are alive and these things are dead, there's literally nothing you could look at without being able to say it has some amount of life. It may not be much, but even a vacuum in space has, you know, the solar wind pouring into it. It's got directionality and flow. And that's one of the ingredients of the process of creating life.
You know, 0 point fluctuations. You know, a cubic centimeter of vacuum contains like the energy of the Big Bang, like all
right.
the time. You know?
Right. There's this sort of this living bubbling going on at a low level, even though it's not biological life, it's geometric life, right?
Yeah,
or process life.
Boiling up out of the vacuum and disappearing back into it, like, you know, the quantum fluctuations. You know.
So this would modify our theory of evolution to say there was no moment when dead things became alive. What there was, you know, when enough living processes and enough living geometry all came together in the same place, they managed to push the organization of matter up to a higher level of being alive to the point that it could start replicating, and we got our first cells. And so it's not a boundary, it's a continuum. You know, there's a relationship between the Earth spinning and having a metallic core that generates the force field that deflects the solar wind and allows us to have an atmosphere, and the fact that we were able to evolve living things that could feed off the atmosphere. You know, there's these feedback loops going on, and you get enough of the right feedback loops, and life's going to happen because it was already happening, just at a lower level of organization.
I think there was someone who said like 10 billion might be that threshold. Like 10 billion atoms gets you a cell, 10 billion cells gets you a multicellular organism. You know, 10 billion multicellular organisms probably gets you, you know, a spacefaring species or something like that. You know?
Right. So there's a similar, the point that I'm trying to get to is there's a similar thing around intelligence. The same argument can be made around intelligence. And we can say that intelligence, you know, as straight sorry, Dowdy, I'm going to say as straight white cis male intellectuals of a certain age, we naturally assume that the brain is the center of all of the important parts of what happens inside a human being. We have this hierarchical top-down, Europe is the pinnacle of evolution and Plato's ideal forms impose themselves on reality. Kind of, we've got this model going on in our heads, right? The great march of progress that goes from fish to amphibians to reptiles, you know, evidently through black people to white intellectual Europeans. You know, the way they always used to draw it is, you know, look, it's Darwin at the top of the chain of creation. Somewhere below him is women, and somewhere below them is, you know, people of color, who obviously space aliens had to make all of their great monuments because we know they're more primitive than we are and we don't know how to make a pyramid. So, you know, the stupidity of the great march of progress is nevertheless all over our culture, right? You know, everybody's thinking it, whether they know they're thinking it or not. So as a result of that really stupid way of modeling human relationships in the cosmos, we tend to think that intelligence is what the brain does. And if the brain's not doing it, it's not intelligence. This is our noetic category, right? What the brain doesn't do isn't intelligence. What the brain does do is intelligence. So our hand doesn't have any intelligence, except for the neurons that reach into it by which our brain tells the hand what to do. We have a master-slave relationship in our heads when we try to understand the relationship of the hand to the brain, right? One gets to be the doer, and one gets to be the thinker and actor and strategizer, and that's where the smarts are. And the other has to be the doer who suffers the imposition of will of the great white colonizer master who lives in my head, right? Because I'm Darwin now. But here's the thing. The problem is we can't actually explain the evolution of intelligence if the only way you can have intelligence is to have a brain. Because then where do brains come from? Right? So is there some, just like the stupid line between living and non-living that we were stuck with in biological evolution when we defined life too narrowly, we're stuck with the same line for the development of intelligence. It's like, is a jellyfish intelligent? Because it doesn't have a brain, but it does have neurons and muscles, and some of them have eyes, right? They can relate to their environment. They just don't do it using a brain. So is that relationship to the environment not intelligent, or is it intelligent? And as long as we stay within the framework of this stupid definition, it's actually unanswerable. Just like we were unable to answer where life came from. First there wasn't life, and then there was, and then all the creationists say, see, science is stupid and that's why God did it. So it's the same thing with intelligence. We're sort of like, so where does intelligence come into play? And next thing you know, people are saying, well, there must be a soul or a spirit to animate the stupid clay of the body because, you know, your model of intelligence doesn't give us any way to explain where it comes from. It must come from beyond, it must come from outside. But you can apply the same redefinition process to intelligence that Christopher Alexander did to life. Why not? You can say, what if we're defining intelligence incorrectly? What if intelligence is not just what the brain does? So for example, when we look at embryogenesis, and here's the cell multiplying into more cells and more cells and more cells, at some point, it folds up into a bell shape, right? To create an inside and an outside. We wouldn't exist without an inside and an outside. The digestive system that goes through us, that whole model of the body depends upon that folding process where the hollow ball does this. How did it know to do that? Right? Did somebody tell it to do that? Was it intelligent or was it stupid? Which was it? Right? In our absolute framework, either it was intelligent and some nervous system told it to do that, or it's completely stupid and not intelligent at all, in which case it couldn't have done the right thing. Why would it do the right thing without intelligence? We're stuck, right? We're trapped on this point. And what we have difficulty understanding is that actually a tremendous amount of the smart things that our body does don't come from our brain at all. They come from our hormones. Like a lot of the process of knowing to run away when the tiger comes has a lot less to do with the brain than it does with the surge of adrenaline that activates our whole body and says, this would be an excellent time to run, right? Or hunger, right? Do we only get hungry when our brain makes an executive decision that it has calculated that in the perfect rational platonic world, this would be the appropriate time to eat? Or is what happens that a whole collection of flora in our intestinal system that have no brains of their own, nevertheless, can say, it's been a while since we fed on anything. We're sitting here in your gut, but it's all empty and there's nothing to do here. We're going to start releasing hormones. And those hormones are going to tell your digestive system, wouldn't it be nice to put something in here? Wouldn't that be great? Let's think about doing that. So your brain sort of follows along after the action of the hormones that were generated in advance to tell it what to do. Now, hormones are just chemicals. And oftentimes you can put your finger on the 1 or 2 chemicals that did the thing. So all this brain work that we categorize as the source of all decision-making, the decider in chief, is actually following along in the train of a simple chemical release. Now, this can be very disconcerting for people who are overinvested in their brains, because the brain's supposed to be in charge, decider in chief, as Bush liked to put it. So how can the brain be following along like a little caboose when the engine is all these single-celled organisms that don't have a brain between them? How is that even possible? Well, we have a choice. We could either come up with some existential excuse for this, escapist excuse for this thing, or we can say, it's possible to have intelligence without a brain. Things can behave intelligently without thinking them through. Things can self-organize in intelligent and survivable and sustainable ways without ever thinking about it. And when we look at the process of biological evolution over time, it's actually hard to come to any other conclusion. Why do species adapt to their circumstances? Do they do it because they had a committee meeting and they voted on it? Did gazelles all get together and sit down with a drafting board and lay out a plan for how they were going to become gnus? Or did they just sort of respond to the circumstances they were in over time, and the ones that responded stupidly are dead because they didn't survive, and we're left with the ones that responded the right way, not because they thought, I know this would be the right way, but because the pressures of evolution organized them into an intelligent direction by process of elimination. That is, could intelligence be a consequence rather than a driver of structure and organization?
That's like the argument that we exist in a universe with consciousness because there's consciousness in this universe to observe it. You know, it's kind of a cat chasing. I think it's called the anthropocentric argument. There's or anthropogenic argument. Yeah, there's a weak and a strong one. That then you start getting into things like simulism. You know, and like this is a simulated universe because look how old the universe is. There's been that much time for simulated computers to exist inside of other simulated computers to make realities.
Well, the more we stick with the notion that intelligence is what we think it is, the more we create sort of a cartoon version of the universe in which the universe has a brain and is thinking, or the universe together is a brain and is thinking. But if we can escape the brain-centered model of intelligence, then we can start to see that even an electron and a proton have a kind of intelligence to them in the sense that they have a teleology, right? They're drawn to each other, and they're going to create a structure that's more complex than either one of them would have done separately, because that's how they're structured. They're structured in such a way to build organization. And organization is intelligence. A crystal has a certain amount of intelligence. It holds itself together, but so does water. Why does water flow? Why does water resist atmosphere? It's got structural intelligence to it that makes it coherent, that makes it respond in certain stereotypical ways. It can have behavior. We could talk about what water does, even though it doesn't have a brain, because it's got structural coherence that's a kind of non-organismic, non-psychological intelligence, a geometric intelligence, if you will. You know what I mean?
A regenerative pattern intelligence.
Yeah. And so one of the things that's interesting when you study evolution is the way in which even single-celled organisms develop vision. You can see single-celled organisms where they have parts that are responsive to light, little organelles inside themselves that are responsive to light, and their flagella will swim or not swim depending on if the light's striking this thing or not. So that way, if they're pointing the wrong way, they don't swim, but if they're pointing the right way, they do swim and they head towards the light. So you get this phototropic behavior that seems to be intelligence and perception of the environment and motor function and change in action without any brain or nervous system at all. Mm-hmm. But then once you get multi-celled organisms, they have a problem because now they're in their own way. You know, if the light's coming from one direction, most of the cells in the multicellular organism are being blocked from the light by the other cells that make up the organism. They're shielding them from it. And so they can't respond to the light. You know, if there's a cell at the back that's got a flagellum, he doesn't know that he's supposed to flip-flop because the light's hitting the guy at the front, who's then blocking the light from reaching the guy at the back. So the shift from single cellularity,
that's starting up.
It creates a new generation of problems. Yeah. But the problems are the same problems that the single-celled organisms have. They just have to be solved all over again at a new scale of organization. And so the most primitive single-celled organisms develop hormones. The one that's at the front that's getting the light releases a hormone. The hormone can spread throughout the cells and reach the one in the back. And so the one in the back now swims not in response to the light, but in response to the hormone.
So do you think there's any limit to how many different kinds of specialized cells can make up an organism?
Well, that's a good question. This is a really interesting thing, cell differentiation.
Because that's the problem with the cells blocking the light, that they're connected to the flagella. You know, you've got to have, it creates an imperative to have specialized
it does. And next thing you know, you're developing muscle cells and nerve cells, right?
Yeah. and eye cells
and the whole point of the vision cells and the muscle cells and the nerve cells is to simulate what the single-celled organism was already able to do without any of those things, right? All this amazing structure and intricacy is being developed to solve the same problem, just at a different scale.
And maybe we're still simulating what the proton and electron were doing, you know?
Right. So in some sense, the whole purpose of human intelligence is, in our clumsy multicellular way, to simulate the kinds of correctness of behavior that things without brains were able to do for much simpler reasons, because they were much simpler organisms. We've reached a level of complexity that we can't survive without the brain helping to make up for the mistakes or obscurities or overcomplexity of our structure.
So you could say complexity recapitulates simplicity, maybe, or something like that.
It has to recapitulate simplicity in order to survive. Yeah. The nervous system is just trying to simulate something much simpler in a single-celled organism.
Which is why Alan Watts had that fantasy that everything that exists thinks it's a living human, you know?
Right. And so the core argument there would be that, you know, below the level of psychological intelligence, below the level of biological intelligence, there's structural intelligence. You know, there's the electron and the proton are going to do the thing they're going to do. And, you know, the universe actually works because of it. Thank goodness they do what they do, or everything that we know would fall apart, right? There's a kind of coherency and intelligence that had nothing to do with anybody thinking it through, but had everything.
It's duality in a way, you know?
Yeah. And so it's possible to say that the universe is intelligent without meaning it in a psychological way. That there is a tremendous amount of structural intelligence.
I think as soon as you have duality, you have a form of intelligence, really.
Exactly. Good to see you, Dowdy.
Hey.
See you next week.
I didn't mean to make the thing go over time, but
no, it happens. So I should wrap up and go. But this was fun.
And by the way, the Texas dildo law was 6 is the limit.
And you're like, what's the magic of 7? what terrifying moral crisis ensues when you buy that 7th dildo?
If you get 7 dildos, you'll turn gay and shoot someone.
You become gay. It must be the gay panic, right?
Yeah, right.
Oh God. Anyway, so daughters and granddaughters. So we'll pick this up next week.
They're gonna keep talking about it next week.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, you know, if some of the women who were on last week and were talking about, you know, Kenneth Smith and the masculinity of his writing, and, you know, how does he address women's issues, you know, I think this essay in particular would be a really good one to go through with them and critique with them, because he gets some things right in it and he gets some things wrong in it, and it creates a great opportunity to really wrestle with his philosophy, I think.
It sounds like transhumanists might be a good one to introduce.
Right?
Smith, right?
Yeah.
That opens up a lot of these, you know, human versus other questions, you know.
That's right. So great. We'll do that.
All right. Looking forward to it, Rick.
Thanks, everybody.
David.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, sure. Hey, Rick, what PDF editor do you use?
Well, I do all my word processing, and I'm on a Mac, so I use NeoOffice. If I were on a different platform, I'd use OpenOffice or LibreOffice. Yeah. They're open source word processors, and all 3 of them have the ability to generate a PDF.
Yeah.
But if I want to edit a PDF, I have Adobe Acrobat for that.
Yeah. Okay.
There's probably a Google Workspace app, I would think, too. I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, you can generate PDFs out of the Google Drive Documents word processor as well.
Yeah.
I prefer the OpenOffice suite because it's kind of a more powerful typesetting system than what Google allows in their word processor.
Yeah.
Yay, open source.
Okay.
Is there stuff you want to change? Were you thinking about something in particular?
No. I'm just gonna noodle around with it.
Okay.
All right. So there's a number of things I wanted to talk to you about, but we never seem to get a chance.
Oh, well, I need to take a little break, but then we can chat afterwards.
Yeah, well,
can I chat you up on my coupon quality economic idea? Like,
yeah, right.
Little economic discount relationships based on ideologies. I'm trying to like conceptualize it, and I think you'd be perfect to help me.
Yeah, it'd be fun. We should do that.
Yeah.
All right, let's till next week, I guess.
Okay.
Oh, by the way, do you code, Rick? Are you?
Oh yeah.
What language do you code in?
M.
What's it called?
M.
Oh, wow.
It's a medical programming language.
Okay. Huh.
So that's what I use.
Wow.
All right, talk to you later.